So now we'll just start our webinar in this special issue from the Utilities Policy Journal. Here we have this interesting name, Water Privatization, Lessons and Pitfalls. This volume was organized by Professor Mildred Warner from Cornell University. And now I'll just share a couple of the slides on the institution which is holding this webinar series, which is the Young Scholars Initiative. I'm Renan Almeida. I'm a professor in the Federal University of São João del Rei in Brazil. And I will tell a very short story about this institution, which is the Young Scholars Initiative, which we call YSI. YSI was founded in 2012, 4 years after the subprime crisis. So in 2008, subprime crisis led to the creation of this institute called Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET. Then, 4 years later, in the INET annual conference in Berlin, more than 500 young scholars applied for only training conference tickets. So there's a pressure to make more space available for young scholars, which led to the creation of YSI. And since then, the community was built via social media channels and through webinars, reading groups, as well as joint conference participations. For example, AAG, United States, where I met Mildred for the first time, Regional Studies Association, the Trento Festival in Italy, some World Bank meetings, and Diamantina Seminar in Brazil, etc. So there are a lot of conferences. In general, the approach is to try to make a short seminar before the start of the main conference or just after the end. The community works through working groups, which are organized based on topics. So we have like economic history or economic development, or inequality or sustainability, or some geographical spaces for it, like Africa or South Asia, etc. Personally, I'm one of the founders of the urban regional economics, which is my background. Nowadays, the community is spread across the globe. We have a lot of people in Western Europe, in the United States, in Brazil, in India. And how to make a part of it is free. It's always available online. You can just follow this link and join the work groups to make a profile out there, and that's done. After that, you'll be subscribed in the newsletter, and it's all you need. By now, if you have a personal interest in organizing a seminar or a reading group, just get in touch with us. We are fully open for new members. Simone, who is here helping us organize this talk today, is a postdoc student at the University of Bocconi in Italy, and she is one of the coordinators of the urban and regional working groups nowadays. Rafael Campos, who is a lecturer now in Brazil, is one of the coordinators. He's with us in this talk today also. Here is just a print screen of the profile, so that's it. Mildred, please, now I turn to you and feel free to talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Renan, and I give thanks to the Young Scholars Network for allowing us to hold this webinar today and celebrate the special issue of utilities policy focused on water privatization lessons and pitfalls. Are you advancing the slides, Renan? Or shall I?
Yeah.
So I want to draw your attention to all of the articles that are available in the special issue. I've also put the link in the chat. And we have all of the authors here today presenting. So we'll move through the papers pretty quickly and hope to have a fair bit of discussion. Next slide. So one of the issues was that privatization was supposed to save cost. Prior research has found no statistical support for this claim. There have been case studies of cost savings, but you can find cases on both sides of the issue. But from a statistical perspective, we haven't found a strong support for that claim. And the papers in this special issue still show that this claim is overstated. In the United States, we have really excellent data on California, and we'll have two papers this morning by Onda and Tawari and Pierce and Gomser Daskalakis talking about that data. And then we also have cases from Germany and Italy, Hellwig and Polk from Germany, and Diamore, Landriani, and Lepore from Italy. And what these papers show is that we need to move beyond this dichotomy focus on public versus private and give attention to a wider array of ownership types and management concerns. And in the second session, we'll do the first 4 papers, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll do the next papers, the next 5. And in that second session, we'll be talking about the importance of regulation, politics, affordability, environmental conservation, and finance. And those papers are by Almeida, Hanna, Warner, Shoring, and Santos. Next slide. So for the first session, we'll turn it over now to Kyra Gomser Daskalakis on her work on water systems in California, followed by Kyle Onda, also on water systems in California, then Andreas Polk on Germany, and Gabriella De Amore on Italy. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kyra.
Great, thank you so much. I guess I will start sharing my screen. Right. Hopefully everyone can see this.
Yes.
Excellent. Great. So my name is Kira Moser Daskalakis. I know it's quite a mouthful. Unfortunately, my co-author, Dr. Pierce, couldn't be here today. He really hoped he could make it, but I'll be presenting for the both of us, talking about water system arrangements in California cities. So I'm currently a PhD student at the University of California, Davis, but the majority of this research was done while I was working with Dr. Pierce at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, where he is currently co-director. So to sort of motivate this paper, which is focused on drinking water, cities are expected to directly or indirectly provide utility services to their residents, but there's really a wide range at least in California, in what those service arrangements are, and especially for drinking water. So there has been a lot of literature looking at this sort of city private provider binary, or the idea that cities will make a decision to provide water themselves or contract out to a private provider. And increasingly, there has been some recognition in the literature of other system arrangement types, particularly special districts, which are single purpose local governments created through voters that are especially common in California and also Texas, as well as literature on mixed service delivery arrangements and also intermunicipal service delivery with cities coming together to jointly provide a service. However, what sort of motivated our study was realizing that there hasn't been a lot of work considering these different provider types jointly, and really considering the diversity of different arrangements that cities may have, particularly in California, where we've seen cities that have multiple service providers for a given city coexisting, and then considering what some of these service outcomes might be from those arrangement types. So for this paper and some forthcoming papers as well that we're working on, we have a data set of all the utility service providers for water, sewer, and trash for the 482 incorporated cities in California. So this paper really focuses on the water providers, but we also collected socioeconomic and governance data for these cities. And so we had 2 methods that identified the water systems in cities. The majority was from scraping of municipal websites that typically list the water systems that are serving their residents, and then GIS matching of boundaries of systems and cities. And so to classify the governance types of those cities, we modified a classification that we previously used when looking at water systems in Los Angeles County, and also drew on a classification that Dobbin et al. Used for California as a whole. So that's really considering the private investor-owned utilities, the city-run systems, the special districts that we've traditionally seen a lot of work on in the literature, but also some of these other types, for instance, when there's multiple systems, and also mutual water companies, which are private but not for profit and more common in the Western United States. So here's a list of some of the city characteristics that we collected, for example, incorporation date and population, also some political and socioeconomic characteristics of the residents and city level financial risk, as well as the number of enterprise funds in a city, which is a good correlate for how many city-run services there are within the city. So we used descriptive statistics and correlations to look at some of the relationships between these different city characteristics and water system types and number. But the bulk of the paper really looks at these multivariate regressions. So we looked at two different outcomes. First is a binary logit model that looked at the presence of a city-run water system in a city, and then a multinomial logit model that looked at the influence of these city characteristics on this wider range of arrangement types. So we have the three sort of, the big three, I guess we could say, only served by an investor-owned utility, which was our baseline, served by a city, and then served by a special district. But then this final category captures these instances where cities in California have multiple water systems or another type. So in support of a lot of that previous literature that really operates on a single service provider assumption, we do see that 80% of cities are served by a single provider that is either a municipality, in investor-owned utility, or a special district. And in California, special districts were more common than the private providers. But a sizable minority, about 20% of cities, had more than one service provider in their jurisdiction. And of those, close to 70% were actually served by more than one system type. So we are seeing instances in California where a city-operated system will actually be coexisting with a private system or special districts or multiple different types, which expands beyond this sort of assumption of there being a single provider in a city. It also raises some questions about to what extent cities are sort of in control of making the decisions about who is providing water in their jurisdiction and how much of a factor sort of historic arrangements of water systems, even prior to incorporation, might be influencing these patterns. So in support of that, we did find that in our regression models, city incorporation date was actually the most consistent and significant variable across all of our models. So cities are more likely to operate their own water system when they are older, so they have an earlier incorporation date, but younger cities are more likely to be served by special districts or by multiple systems. Cities are also more likely to have their own water system if they have a larger population, a higher proportion of their population that is non-Hispanic white, and have lower levels of financial risk. And we also included binary variables indicating if a city is located in one of the 6 major metropolitan statistical areas of California, as well as Los Angeles County, which we pulled out for being particularly large and politically unique. And so we did find in our multinomial logit model that there were significant regional effects. So cities in Los Angeles County were significantly less likely to have a city-run water system. And cities in the Riverside, San Bernardino, and San Francisco Bay Area MSAs were more likely to have special district systems. And finally, cities in San Diego were significantly less likely to have the other or multiple system types category. So we then wanted to think about some of the outcomes of these different service arrangements. So we did 2 kind of smaller pieces of analysis looking at water conservation outcomes and water rate outcomes. So for conservation, we had data from the California Governor Office Annual Planning Survey in 2018, and 293 cities had responded with the number of water conservation practices that they had in place, which includes, for example, landscape standards, water use restrictions, or water metering. And we did find that in this sample, there was statistically significantly more water conservation practices in cities that had a city-run water system by about 1 extra practice compared to these other system types. And one possible theory on this that might be due to the kind of level of coordination that's required between the water systems and the city government in order to implement these practices. It might be more difficult coordination-wise for separately operated systems to implement some of these practices alongside city governments. And finally, we looked at water rates of cities that had particularly high levels of intracity system fragmentation, or just very high numbers of water systems in their boundaries in LA County. And this was a good level of focus because actually the vast majority of cities with high levels of fragmentation are located in LA County. So of the 14 cities that had more than 4 water systems in their jurisdiction in California, 11 of them are located in LA County. And the other 3 are still in Southern California, which does suggest some regional patterns in water system fragmentation. So if we look at the 11 cities, we found that somewhat consistent average rates across the cities actually hid a lot of variation within cities for these multiple systems. And so, for example, in West Covina or in Norwalk, a customer that is served by the highest rate water system for the same amount of water will be paying more than double what the customer of the lowest rate system in the city will be paying, which raises equity and affordability concerns. And as a final note, water system fragmentation isn't just an issue within city boundaries, which is what we examined for this paper. If you look at the total number of water systems in California, you'll see that the vast majority are located in unincorporated areas, but they're serving a much smaller population, which does raise questions about the level of fragmentation in unincorporated areas and potential for consolidation to improve outcomes. And so as our next step, we are currently finishing up a draft of a paper that uses this same data set, but is examining cities that have a city-run water system that extends water service to unincorporated areas around them or to other municipalities, and examining some of the city characteristics associated with that, and also particularly looking at some of these historic factors related to annexation and incorporation that might be explaining some of these patterns of water system extension and fragmentation in cities and outside of cities. So I believe that is all I have, and hopefully I've left plenty of time for questions.
You have, that's excellent. You've come in 1 minute under, so we have 4 minutes for questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions of Kira. Well, I have one. So you've talked about this in very general terms, but when we talk about fragmentation and the unincorporated areas and the differences in prices, are the affordability problems greater for the unincorporated areas outside the city?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And we definitely want to be gathering more data to be certain about that. But one thing that's particularly concerning for unincorporated areas is a lot of these systems are very small and they have low financial capacity or infrastructure capacity. And so their rates will tend to be higher from having to, they have less of a customer base to spread those costs over, and that often leads to very high water costs, which is certainly an affordability concern, and especially given sort of some of the socioeconomic differences for rural areas in California, at least.
Kyle.
Picking off right where you left off, I'm wondering if you either looked at or are planning to look at what might even exacerbate this further, or if you've seen in the data, I haven't bothered to look in California yet, but I've seen it elsewhere, the prevalence of even local government run systems who charge different, usually higher rates specifically for the areas outside of the municipality that they serve.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think we'll definitely hope to be able to look at that. We're trying to figure out what kind of water data we can get for these systems that are extending service. But that's definitely an excellent point, especially if extending service might be an opportunity, or some cities might view it as an opportunity to gain additional revenue for their water system through extension. That's an excellent point.
We have a question in the chat from Ramakrishna, do you want to ask it directly, Ramakrishna? And while he's doing, or she's doing that, would you stop sharing your screen so that Kyle could start sharing his?
Yes.
Ramakrishna may have voice issues. They're asking, do you account for any topographical or other difficulties behind the high cost in cities?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So our kind of small sample that we looked at for the water rates in this paper was really looking at rates for systems serving a single city, which is a pretty small jurisdiction. So we would expect that these sort of difficulties that may lead to higher costs would be experienced by all of these systems because they're serving such a small geographic area. So we wouldn't really expect these kind of extreme disparities in water rates that we do see, which raises more of a question about sort of what governance factors might be driving some of those high costs.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, audience, for discussion. You see the idea here, quick, short presentations so we can get a couple of questions in between each paper and keep the dialogue going. Kyle is up next with another paper on water systems in California, which I think is pulling from the same database.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Warner. I'm looking at much of the same systems, maybe with a complementary lens. So we'll see what people think. So my name's Kyle Onda. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill in the Urban Planning Department, and I'm the technical director for the Internet of Water project at Duke University. I'm pleased to present this study on the geography of private water system ownership in California and a descriptive analysis of correlations between private ownership types and affordability. So much of the early scholarly debate on water privatization cast things as relatively dichotomous, as Dr. Warner said. However, there are a variety of institutions that might shape the incentives and constrain the behavior of privately owned water systems. We wanted to investigate some basic descriptive questions on this topic, namely, given that different kinds of private ownership arrangements are institutionalized, where do we find these varieties in the landscape in California? And relatedly, whom do these different types of water systems serve? Moreover, much of the debate about private participation in the water sector focuses on implications for affordability. The reasons that water rates tend to be higher in privately owned systems, at least for-profit ones, are straightforward. But we wanted to probe a bit deeper and explore what the associations between private ownership and the customer experience of higher water rates is. We explore this in terms of traditional measures of affordability, as in some proportion of income, as well as on some direct consequences of higher rates, such as higher propensities to go into arrears or be shut off for non-payment. For this study, we focused on water systems in California for two big reasons. First, it's a large state with a large sample size of water systems within the overall state regulatory framework. And second, it has a unique combination of publicly accessible system level data, which has been leveraged by many. So in this study, we conducted several analyses on nested subsamples of the systems in California. The US EPA and the California water boards have enumerated close to 3,000 water systems that serve some kind of permanent residential population. Of that group, the California Water Board has collected data categorizing most of these into an ownership type that I'll get into in a moment. Roughly half of these systems have a service area boundary geospatial data and are large enough to have reliable data regarding demographics and household income from the census. And a small subset, generally representative of the 400 largest systems in the state, have detailed rate structure information and data about shutoffs and customer arrears. So getting into ownership types, this sort of institutional diversity. In the California Water Board's data, there are several types of ownership that are indicated. So in addition to the well-known categories of local government, which includes kind of the special districts that Kira was just talking about, as well as normal municipally owned systems, and then the for-profit systems that are regulated by a public utilities commission. There are other varieties of privately owned systems, including nonprofit mutual water companies. These tend to be things like homeowners associations that only provide water for their neighborhood. And then small private systems like mobile home parks. On this slide, I'm showing the importance of using actual service area boundaries. So in this example, on the left, the Bakersfield metro area is split between several municipalities, which are cross-cut themselves by several water systems. So notably, the eastern half of Bakersfield is mostly served by a large for-profit water system, while the higher income western half is served mostly by the municipal government. Meanwhile, a large collection of other types of private systems and smaller local governments are serving outlying communities. So again, the same kind of issues that Kira was discussing. So now I'll move on to our analyses. First, we wanted to ask, where do different types of water systems tend to serve? We wanted to understand their relative importance along the urban-rural continuum in California. To try and measure this, we assigned each water system to the largest urbanized area as defined by the census that it spatially intersects. For example, we assigned the East Bay Municipal Utilities District to the greater San Francisco Bay Area, rather than to the inland urbanized areas that it also intersects. While this Contra Costa Water District, which intersects no census urbanized area, we classify as rural. To describe the location and importance of each water system type across the urbanization spectrum, we binned here the urbanized areas into 4 categories, in addition to the null rural category. And these categories are small towns with less than 10,000 people to small urban areas between 10,000 and 100,000 people, larger urban areas with between 100,000 and 1 million people, and then the very large urban areas with greater than 1 million. We find that mutual water companies, the homeowners association, and the other very small private systems like mobile home parks tend to be larger in small urban areas than they are in either small towns or mid-sized cities, perhaps indicating there might be some kind of niche, either institutionally or physically, for these types of systems in areas where populations are relatively large, but local government systems are not comprehensive. Now I'm speculating this might be sort of a similar issue with the newness of a municipality being associated with this kind of thing. Here we find that the local government system serve only 60% of the rural population and over 80% of across the board of urban populations. Meanwhile, the for-profit investor-owned utilities in orange serve the highest proportion of the population in both the rural and the very large urban areas, while being less prominent in smaller cities and towns. So now I'll move to differences in income, where we focused on the 1,300 systems that we had reliable household income data. We simply tested using the differences between the ownership types as indicator variables in a regression on these 4 measures of income distribution. Household income, 20th percentile household income, percent below twice the federal poverty level, and the Gini coefficient. We found no statistically significant differences in any of the measures between the for-profit systems and the non-PUC regulated private systems or the local government. We did find that mutual water companies, those HOAs, have somewhat higher income than the local government systems, and much lower incomes in the privately owned businesses, which tend to be mobile home parks. Given these differences, one might assume that any differences in rate structures between water system ownership types are not simply driven by willingness to pay. In this analysis, we test whether the different ownership types have different wage affordability ratios when controlling for 2 important factors. An affordability ratio is a measure of a water bill for a reasonable or non-discretionary amount of water as a proportion of a representative household income. We use 2 affordability ratios, one calculated at the 20th percentile of income and one calculated at the median household income, as it's historically but done in the water industry in the US. We calculate the water bills assuming a non-discretionary volume of water of 50 gallons per capita per day, which some might consider too generous, but we calculate this as a variety of household sizes. We can do this thanks to the open water rates data produced by the California Water Data Collaborative, which standardized rate structures in a machine readable format so we can accurately calculate water bills for arbitrary water volumes. As for the other elements, we control for the log of the service population to test for an association that might be suggestive of economies of scale. as well as the size of the urbanized area that we assigned earlier to control for potential agglomeration effects, such as costs being lower for parts, services, and expertise for utilities that are situated in larger urban economies. So we found that relative to both the 20th percentile and the median household income, for-profit water systems, perhaps expectedly, have significantly higher water rates. We also found evidence suggestive of both scale and agglomerative economies along the same order of magnitude. So while affordability ratios, like I showed, are somewhat illuminating, we are also interested in the follow-on consequences of this, such as arrears and shutoffs, which indicate that people may be having trouble paying bills or accessing water services consistently. The California Water Boards does collect information regarding such events in their mandatory surveys of water systems, although we must interpret the data with caution as they are still self-reported. In the interest of time, I'm showing one model of interest here, a regression of the proportion of connections that were shut off at least once during the year on the ownership category, the affordability ratio at the 20th percentile of income, and the proportion of the population living below twice the poverty level. We found that intuitively, more unaffordable rates are strongly correlated with more shutoffs. However, for-profit systems surprisingly had 2 percentage point lower shutoff rates than local government systems, assuming they have the same rate structure. So one possible explanation is that most of the for-profit utilities, which are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, are required to have a subsidy program, while other systems are not. However, there are many other explanations that might be correlated with this behavior rather than the subsidy program itself, such as more active customer relations and collections activity in private systems. If we inspect the local government systems, we see that about a quarter of those have some kind of subsidy program, although 57% of the total population live with such a program. So indicating that local government systems with subsidy programs tend to be larger ones. This may be due in part to a regulation associated with Proposition 218 in California, which says government service fees must be in proportion to the cost of the service rendered to the user unless ratified by a vote. So this can be a large barrier for customer assistance programs for publicly owned utilities that privately owned ones don't face. So what lessons can we draw from this work? First, we found that economies of scale and agglomeration might be important for affordability. Possibly even more so than the ownership structure, at least in California. We found that water systems are diverse and highly fragmented, and that the private sector might fill an important role in rural areas where there's less institutional support for local government water systems. For-profit systems are most prevalent in large urban areas. Finally, we found that perhaps regulatory mandates can shape the way households experience affordability. High water rates can be mitigated in their impact on low-income customers. On the other hand, unrelated regulations on local governments can preclude their own ability to protect low-income households from high water rates. An outcome of this work is a speculation we have that we'd like to follow up with mixed methods research. We hypothesize that in certain contexts, for-profit systems face greater scrutiny from political actors than local government systems, ultimately resulting in some form or other stronger protections for low-income systems, or for low-income households, despite higher water rates than might exist in local government systems. Of course, we'd like to explore the conditions under which this might hold true. And with that, I'll stop.
Great, thank you. You've come exactly in at time, and you've left us with a very provocative proposition, which I'm sure will generate some questions. So let me open the floor to questions for Kyle.
So Kyle, how strong are the local regulations in this final proposition? I mean, how strong the local authorities can indeed push the for-profit systems to have really affordability concerns?
So in this case, it's really the state government that would have such things rather than the local government. So all of this is in the California context, where the Public Utilities Commission does place certain requirements. The extent to which those requirements are actually complied with should be a subject for further research. But anecdotally, I've seen data in Pennsylvania that has, you know, all the US states have public utilities commissions that nominally do this sort of thing. But you know, in Pennsylvania, this dynamic doesn't seem to be doing anything for cutoffs for low income people. So it's a very state level thing, I think.
Yes, Marcella.
Kyle, can you talk a little bit more about sort of like what you were referring to as the constraints by local owned utilities to protect the low income households?
So yeah, so in California, there's as part of all local government sort of constitutional issues, a local government has to charge for services. A local government charging for services, so it could be anything, water, sewer, trash, pickup, whatever. Those rates have to be in proportion to the cost of the service provided. And that is in conflict with how most sort of subsidy programs that a utility is running can be financed, because that has to be financed essentially by cross subsidy from other rate owners. And so that precludes that option, or at least it represents some sort of barrier for many water systems.
Kyle, we have a question from Andreas, and I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen and he can start sharing his because he'll be our next speaker. But go ahead with your question, Andreas.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice presentation. It's very interesting. I have a question concerning the regulation, and maybe you mentioned it already in the answer to the question before mine. Which type of a regulation is it? Is it cost regulation? Is it price regulation? Because that provides different incentives in terms of investing into infrastructure. And dependent on the regulation, we could see different kinds of outcomes. And if your outcome is that you have, let's say, less water blackouts, I'd say, or higher water security in the market, that could be due to the regulation approach. And at the same time, maybe the difference between private utilities and public utilities is that private utilities simply care more about it because they do not make revenues in the time when the system is not working, whereas public utilities probably say, well, I don't care, because I mean, we are public, we are not for profit, that's it. So can you comment on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think in the shortest possible terms, I just agree with your statement. I think regulations are what drives stuff more than ownership, but regulations are about ownership. And in terms of California, the regulation I'm talking about is about prices, while private utilities, on the other hand, face sort of cost, they face an economic price regulation. So they have to justify rate increases to the state government based on some estimate of their cost of service. Although there's arguments about how truthful is everyone being all the time with that. I forgot the last part of your question, I'm sorry, but.
Maybe just a short one. It's about the idea that there's a higher water security with private firms.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. It's worth investigating further. I certainly want to. Having worked for a public utility in the past, I can tell you that cutoffs are actually an expensive thing to do. You have to send someone out to do it. And then I'll go undo it. And it might be private utilities have just, it's frankly, they recover more money by being flexible and offering people ways to avoid shutoffs.
So while Andreas is putting up his slides, Ramakrishna, you have a question? Ramakrishna?
I have a couple of questions.
Well, just one for now, and
audible?
we'll save the others for the discussion. But just one to get it going, and then save the others for the discussion.
Yeah, my only question. Sorry, should I hold on?
You want to hold it till the end, or? I guess the barking dog.
I'm sorry. I'll post it on the chat box. Okay.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll turn it over to Andreas Polk now, and we'll come back to the questions that Ramakrishna has when we get to the discussion, because we have about 15 minutes for a group discussion at the end. So Andreas, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all, Mildred, for your effort in putting the special issue together, and Renan for organizing that nice event here. I really appreciate it. Nice to get to know you all and being able to introduce our paper here. So this is joint work by Michael Hellweg, who's a friend of mine and colleague, who was at ZEW Mannheim, which is a research institute, and now left academia and is active in the private sector. And me, I'm a professor of Berlin School of Economics and Law, and I teach economics, of course. So what did we do and what do we do in our paper? So we are interested in the German water markets, and here especially in the political economics context of the water markets. Just to give you a brief introduction to the markets, because I guess not everybody is familiar with Germany and its very dispersed system of water supply. So we have about 6,000 regional water utilities, which are all local monopolies. And the governance structure is quite diverse, which is the case in many, many countries, and which we learned already, where we learned about some examples. So we have public utilities, we have private utilities, we have some kind of mixed forms, we have private utilities in state ownership, and so on and so on. What is interesting, and this relates to the discussion which we had now with Kyle, is if the water utility is a public utility, it can choose either to charge what is called a fee or to take a price. So this is a choice of the utility. If it's public, if it's private, it has to take prices. But if it's public, there's the ability to choose between charging a fee or charging a price. So what's the difference? Because finally it's all price. It is, but there's a difference in terms of supervision. So if the firm decides to charge a price, if it's a public utility which decides to charge a price, then it's subject to competition policy regimes by the states usually. And if it decides to charge a fee, it's subject to communal supervision. What is the difference? And here it relates a bit to what Kyle said. Well, if I understand Kyle correctly, maybe what you presented to us was closer to communal supervision in Germany, which is the supervisor takes costs as given and prevents from overcharging above costs. So there might be a markup, but the markup is not allowed to be too high, but given costs, and there's no check for the cost level. What is the difference to competition policy? Competition policy also cares about the cost level. So it could be that the costs are excessively high, and this may also be part of the competition policy investigation. And you might be sued not for overcharging, but for having excessively high costs, which is not possible with communal supervision. So that's the difference between those two supervision regimes. Then water utilities may cross-subsidize alternative services like swimming bath, telecommunication services, sometimes parking lots, etc., etc. So it's a pretty diverse system which we've got when it turns to water supply in Germany. So what is our research question? What is probably special to the water markets in Germany is that very often we observe something which we call political links between the regional water utilities and the local governments. These links usually exist in the supervisory boards. So it's not the management boards, but the supervisory boards, if it's public utilities. So that means people who are active in the supervisory board very often belong to one particular party, are a member of a party, and we wonder if, let's say, the idea that the member of the supervisory board belongs to the same party as the mayor or local representatives in the political sphere in that area might have an influence on water prices. So the idea here is that probably those prices may be used to cross-subsidize other services, which might be beneficial then to the politicians. So the question is in fact the water utility some kinds of means to serve political needs to particular politicians? So that is the research question we are interested in. And the answer is, I believe it's a good answer in that sense that it indicates that we can probably relax a bit on that, because I guess we can all agree that having the idea that political influence on water prices exists is probably not the best type of, let's say, allocation mechanism which we want to have in those markets. And therefore, it's probably good news that we do not find strong indication that those political economics aspects do play a role. No? So it seems to be, first of all, economic variables which influence the water prices. There are some effects of the governance structures, which is in line with the existing literature. We have some indication that political influence might play a role, but these are only minor, let's say, indications. So generally speaking, we can be, I'd say, probably happy about the results, which we found that there doesn't seem to be such a strong influence of the political sphere on water prices. So what did we do? And I do not show the table. I have it here if you're interested in seeing the regression outcome, but I believe that it's more interesting to see the main ideas here. So we collected data on 183 German water utilities, which is not so much given 6,000 in our population, but it was really a huge effort to collect all the information, especially about the political links, because here we use social networks like Sing, etc., to find out if political links exist and to gather all the data. So we stopped with 183 because here we also thought that we get a good idea about what's happening here. So what is the dependent variable which we use? It's the water price per year of an average household. To be more precise, as the price is usually, or let's say the expenditure usually consists of a variable part of the fee and a fixed element of the fee. In fact, we use the expenditure of an average household, but you can calculate it down to having price equivalent measures as well. No? We use different kinds of method to calculate that, but I don't want to go into detail here, so you'll find more information in our paper. Then we have a baseline model, which includes costs and demand factors, which are more or less the usual things which are put into these models, like costs of infrastructure, soil classes, the net density. Then we have demand factors like demographic trend, because some of the regions face a declining demographic trend. They are different in purchasing power, etc., etc. Then we also include governance variables like ownership, prices versus fees, what I mentioned already, and which relates to the presentation by Kyle, for instance. We also put in the existence, or if there are alternative services which might be loss-making service or supposed to be loss-making services like swimming pools, swimming baths, or maybe also profit-making service, probably like telecommunication services, etc. And then we collected the data on the political economic side of what we are interested in. So first of all, we analyzed if there are political links which we can establish between the water company and the local governments. And we say, yes, a political link exists if there's one member in the advisory board which belongs to the same party as the local representative. No? That determines what the political link is. We also include a variable on political competition in a supervisory board. So the idea here is, if the members of the supervisory board of the water utility belong to different kinds of parties, that might have an effect on the link in terms of politics and in subsidizing or cross-subsidizing certain kinds of services. And we will see some results here in a minute. So what are the results? And if you don't mind, I skipped the table. I've got it here. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to ask and I show it to you. But the main result here, and this is what I believe is in fact, let's say from a normative point of view, a positive result, which is that it's mainly cost and demand parameters which are correlated with prices. So we find, for instance, that the soil class, that means the hardness of the ground, where you have to dig to put your infrastructure in, has an effect on prices. Usually the more difficult it is, the more costs arise, and therefore prices are higher. So we have also effects of the demand parameters. For instance, purchasing power have an influence, but also the demographic trend, which has a strong influence, especially in those regions, which means that in those regions where we have declining population, water prices tend to be higher on average, which is not surprising because for a given infrastructure, you have to allocate the costs to a smaller population. So that's not surprising. And I think it's in line with the literature. So what now about the political economy variables and the governance variables we are especially interested in? And here we see that the political links are not positively correlated with prices. And by the way, there are also no party effects. So we divided between left and right party spectrum, the usual approach which is taken here. And we do not see any direct or let's say strong positive correlation between the level or the water prices and the existence of those political links. But, and that's got good news, we believe. No? But what we do see is that given that those political links exist, and given that in the advisory board, there is some kind of political competition, that means different members belong to different political parties, we see a correlation with higher prices. So our interpretation here is that it may be that first of all, if a link exists, there is certain kind of relation between the water utility and the political sphere, which let's say allows politics to influence what's happening in the water utility. And now, given that there's a diverse set of interests within the water utility, it may be that, or we see that the prices are higher, and therefore it could be that, let's say, political compromises take place at the level of the water utility, and therefore we see higher prices here. So
Andreas, you're at 12 minutes, so you'll want to wrap it up.
Yeah, okay. So what do we see concerning the supplementary services? We do not see any consistent picture here. And then we also checked if the governance structure has an effect on the price level. And we have a weak indication, which is not significant, statistically significant, which might be due to our small sample, that public utilities tend to charge lower prices, again, which is consistent to what we heard already. But we do not see any effect of the regulation scheme or competition policy regime, which public utilities choose in terms of its effect on prices. So thanks, Mildred, for reminding me of the 12 minutes. So I stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Great. So we have a chance here for some questions, and it's really nice the way Andreas has been able to unpack the specific political issues. Do we have questions from the audience? I'm curious as to why competition among political parties on the advisory board of the utility would lead to higher prices. Why do you think that is?
Well, in fact, we don't know exactly. We can only imagine what the reason can be here. So it could be that if there are more political interests within the utility, and there is some link which is established to the political decision maker, that this might, let's say, in terms of political compromise, lead to, the idea that more needs are served within the water utilities. But this is just an idea of how we can probably explain what we found here. So this is probably also an issue which might be up to future research to find out. First of all, if we still find it, if we have a larger sample size, and then to get more into that issue, why, how this, let's say, effect works. But this is just a guess how that might work. You see, I'm not so convinced by my own explanation yet. That's why it's probably better to do a bit more research on that. So there's only the indication right now.
Other questions from the group? So Andreas, I'd like you to stop sharing your screen so that Gabriela can pull up hers. And I guess I want to pose for the group to be thinking about this issue of politics and regulation and political interest, because when we come to the full group discussion, I hope we can get into this a little bit more. So thank you very much, Andreas, and we'll come back to you with more questions. Oh, I'm sorry, Kyle has a question in the chat. Germany is perhaps stereotyped as having a stable, non-corrupt political culture. Do you have plans to do this analysis in other countries?
Well, the answer is it depends if we can gather good data. First of all, I believe you're right that the level of corruption is rather low, or supposed to be rather low in Germany, but that doesn't mean that political influence doesn't take place. So I'd like to differentiate here between corruption and political influence. And even though the level of corruption is rather low, that doesn't mean that these political issues exist and might be seen in the data. If you ask for other countries, well, we are open to it because I believe the research question, especially the political economics aspect, is quite interesting. And yes, we are open to it, but we don't have a plan right now, and I cannot name a country. But if you have a good idea and let's say believe that we can find good data, tell me, and I'm interested to get into that kind of research, because I think it's quite an interesting question, and there are many more countries we can do research on.
Well, that's why we're really happy to be able to have this webinar today. Thanks again to Renan and the Young Scholars Network for helping make this happen. Let's now turn attention to Italy and talk about that. That's what's so nice about the special issue and the Zoom world we're all in, is that we can all be here together from around the world. So Gabriela, why don't you take it away? You're muted.
The microphone, Gabriela.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Hello to everyone. I'm glad to be here for presenting our research on the economic, social, and environmental sustainability of Italian water utilities. Our research comes out from analyzing previous study on the relationship between ownership structure and the water utilities performance, that have found no convergent solution about which ownership structure may ensure higher performance, economic performance, especially in terms of efficiency, productivity, and cost savings. Over the last decade, in parallel with increased attention to sustainability issues, a growing number of scholars have pointed out the need to extend this analysis to other measures of performance, especially to environmental and social performances. We use it for our theoretical framework, 3 different theories: sustainable development theory, institutional theory, and stakeholder theory. And especially institutional theory supports our and other scholar idea that for water governance, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, because historical, geographical, socioeconomic context can strongly influence water utilities performance. So the aim of our research is to investigate how socioeconomic context and the stakeholder interest influence the relationship between ownership structure and water utilities sustainability performance. We decided to focus on Italian context. In Italy, from the middle of the 90s to the middle of the 2000s, there have been a lot of reforms aimed at sourcing the management of utilities to private operators, assuming these were more efficient than public ones. However, the percentage of private operators in water markets remained low, but the increase of tariffs from some small little operator, private operators in the water to users gave rise to an intense political debate about the benefits and costs of water privatization. And this debate culminated in 2011 in a public referendum that abolished the previous decree aimed at increasing the presence of private operators, and it stopped the remuneration of capital invested by operators with the tariffs. So now we have in Italy 366 utilities, but only 164 utilities provide all the services from collection to wastewater treatment. The percentage of private companies that own the market is only the 2% of the market. The 59% is owned by public company, while the 39% by mixed companies. The real problem as well is the condition of water infrastructures that are critical, especially in the south, where there are some areas where the water leakage reaches still the 60% of the water provided. So and this is also due to the tariffs that are very low, especially if we compare these tariffs to the Italian, to other European cities. So we decided to use a multiple case study methodology to watch this, to look at these water utilities closer, and we used a proposable sampling method to select 6 utilities that differ significantly in their ownership structure, the number of users surveyed, and the context where they operate. And we used the model developed, the multi-criteria model developed by Marquez to measure economic, environmental, and social performance. This is our sample. So we have 6 utilities. 3 of these are mixed utilities and 3 are fully public utilities. As you can see, they differ a lot for the area, geographical area where they operate, and this changed significantly the socioeconomic context, but also the infrastructure that they manage. And as you can see, that it is strongly differ also the size. There are some utilities like Acea and Era that are 2 listed big multi-utilities. This means that they provide to population also waste and energy apart from water. And there is Nuove Acque, that is a small company with that serve just 1,000 users. And we have ABC, that is the first and the only case of the corporatization in Italy after the referendum. Acquedotto Pugliese is a regional big company that operates in the south of Italy, where there is a high percentage of water failures. And SMART instead is located operate in the north of Italy, where there is the unemployment rate is low and the income per capita is high. So here you find several criteria that we have used to measure environmental, social, and economic performance. We added also tariffs because as a proxy also of affordability, of equity, of the social sustainability. Here, I don't want that you focus on this number, but just I want to show you that it is impossible for them to find, for any utility, find to satisfy all stakeholder needs, to achieve the best score for each dimension: economic, social, and environmental. So any of these, each utility has to find is trade-off, is to choose to which stakeholder to satisfy, to which stakeholder has to pay attention to. I can show you better this spider chart. Helps us to compare the performance achieved by the utility. As you can see in the first spider chart, in the first figure, we have a mixed ownership utilities, and in particular, you can see that large listed multi-utilities like ACEA and ERA achieved higher scores in economic performance with higher efficiency in terms of labor costs and higher return on investment, especially for ERA, while they achieve less scores for environmental and social performances, especially for ACEA that apply high tariffs and have also high level of water failures. These can be explained with the influence exercised by private shareholder whose major interest is in dividend, especially for ACEA that has two shareholders that own the 30% of his capital. Nove Acqua instead is a mixed company that operates in Tuscany, and in this case you can we saw that this company may invest large money in infrastructure compared to old utility with 80 euros per user, and we observed also low levels of water failures. But this company apply high tariffs thanks to the population that is where the socioeconomic condition high better than the other. In completely public owned utilities like ABC, SMAT, and Acquedotto Pugliese, that is the regional company, performance strongly depends on the socioeconomic context, with the high orientation toward the disadvantaged people and workers for ABC, and the greater attention to investment and environmental sustainability for SMAT that operate in the northern area where the unemployment rate is very low, and it can apply higher tariffs. So the good economic performance of Acquedotto Pugliese instead can be explained with his large dimension that allowed to achieve economies of scale. But in this case, the tariffs are higher, but also the water leakages are higher. So what we can get some conclusion about this research, that public and private debate versus private debate regarding the ownership structure of water provider is sometimes misleading and can only partially explain their performance, while contextual factors, contextual variables, and particularly the socioeconomic conditions of people living in the areas where the water utility operates, such as the unemployment rate, the per capita income, contribute to explain water utilities performance. The socioeconomic context, infrastructural requirements, citizen participation and income, and can influence the behavior of company at least as much as the ownership structure. Even though we have just 6 utilities, we can give some policy recommendation to shift the attention from legal forms, ownership structure, and building procedures to investments and technological solutions to improve efficiency, and also to the role of stakeholder and special stakeholder and specific local needs. Also, the achievement of SDG 6 by Agenda 2030 calls for a complete rethinking of policy and governance models towards collaboration among all actors involved in water sector, since sustainability is something that cannot be achieved by a single actor alone. Just I stop here that this is our future research. We are working to extend analysis to many other companies. We would like to analyze the sustainability performance of water utilities located in 31 world countries for the last 20 years, so to have a quantitative analysis and to analyze the same things, the ownership structure and how contextual factors can influence the relationship between ownership structure and performance. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions or to have any other suggestion for future research.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. And your future research project sounds like something this group is going to be very interested in as we look across different country contexts. Questions from the group?
Yeah.
Whoa, Caitlin, do you want to shorten this and ask it so we don't all just read it? You're still, since you're here.
Sure. I just simply put, like, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the citizen mobilization. And I'm thinking of it from a recent book by Andrea Spieler, where he looks at kind of the Italian form of water back in 2011, but argues some of those connections built like are still, you know, playing out today. And I'm just curious, is that something your work like intersected with at all?
About I didn't get the probably the right the question. You mean that if the referendum has played a role on the?
Yeah, I mean more just like the role of social movement mobilization or citizen mobilization in kind of your research.
This is just as we probably better explained in the paper. It was most a political directed referendum, because the mass population this mobilization was mostly political driven, since there was not a real a strong participation of private operators in the market. So also before then 2011, the percentage of operators operating in the market was very low. So this was strongly due to a politicization of the debate that brought to the mass mobilization. Okay.
So this raises the issue of stakeholders. In your slide about internal versus external stakeholders,
yeah,
I think what Caitlin might be asking about is stakeholders like trade unions, social movements, and we'll be getting to this in the next session, where the papers are more expressly political, not so much in the political party form as Andreas was looking at, but in the political and social movements form. If you could show us your stakeholder slide again. I found it a useful way to think of analysis, but I'm wondering if it's got enough of the stakeholders in it for where we might be heading with future work. So you have customers, society, government, pressure groups, media, suppliers. Okay.
Yes. It is mostly driven by political side, by pressure groups, but and by media that brought to the a criticization of the debate and the problem was mostly due to these political pressure groups that exercise their work on mass population. So when we speak about a company, yes, it has a lot of stakeholders, but mostly what we see in the analysis is that while public utilities mostly care about population and mostly care about the socioeconomic condition of population for higher for list private for mixed private mixed utilities companies, especially for listed ones, the most important stakeholder are the owners of the companies that care about their dividend.
Right. So
Right.
Andreas has had to go, but he's raised the question about the ability of this group to combine efforts if we want to do some international comparative work to really get at some of these managerial, ownership, and political economic effects. And it sounds like Gabriella's next stage of research will be moving in that direction. So think of us as a brain trust and the possibilities of collaborating across the group, which was one of the goals that we had with this initiative.
Yes.
I would like to go back to the question raised by Ramakrishna before. Do you want to raise it, Ramakrishna?
Yeah, basically my question was, I've already posted it on the chat box as well, but I don't know whether the speaker is there or not to answer that question. Is basically on the aspect of sorry.
Well, you were asking if the
yeah,
regulator was public or
regulator
independent.
Is whether it is a public regulator or independent regulator, because if it is a public regulator, again, there could be a way of influencing the regulation outcomes. And second was that, like, in India, we find, and in theory also, there is a claim that, like, utilities are expected to do better than the local governments when it comes to the water supply, all aspects of the service. Is that the case in the case of the study that was done?
So I think this is a question for the California papers. It was asked at that time, but it's actually a question for everyone. Did the California papers want to start in, or Gabriella, did you want to say something?
If for the first question about if there is an organ of regulation, is it right? How it regulates the market. In Italy, for example, we have the strong rule of an Italian national independent authority that decide the tariffs, and the tariffs cannot also be increased without investments done in the infrastructure. This is the stronger rule, and it also monitor the quality of the services. So now all the utilities can decide to increase the tariffs, but only if these are approved by the National Independent Authority, and if this increase is justified by the investment in infrastructure. This is due to it aims to reduce the water leakage. So if they do investment, they can also increase the tariffs, otherwise not. This is for the Italian situation. I cannot speak about California context.
Kira, Kyle?
Kira can correct me because she's actually in California, but my understanding is, well, in most US states, the Public Utilities Commissions are a public agency whose commissioners are appointed by the governor. So I guess they're a public agency, but you can see where politics might determine things over the long scope of time, and certainly react to pressing policy issues of the day, right? During COVID, it was the Public Utilities Commission that said you can't cut people off in the end, right? But I'll step back now.
Yeah, Kira told me that she had to go to the class now, so she can't answer, I think, although I think she's still here.
I can stick
okay.
around until 8:30. So
okay,
yeah,
okay.
I am.
Go ahead.
I think
please.
I don't have much to add there. I think Kyle summed that up well. And yeah, I think having that regulator for private utilities is extremely important in the California context, especially when you contrast it with Proposition 218, which Kyle mentioned, which really restricts the way that the local government water utilities raise their rates or set their rates as compared to the private systems that are really justifying themselves to this regulator, as opposed to the local governments that are having to justify themselves to their voters.
There was a very provocative paper a few years ago that suggested that state regulation was better than local government democratic control for ensuring attention to affordability or environmental conservation. And it was also a paper based on California. Kira, does that ring true for you for California?
I think, at least in a few contexts that I'm thinking of in California, there are instances where I think we've seen from like economic literature that water is generally priced too low, at least for the water infrastructure and service, although obviously this still raises affordability concerns for households. But I think when voters are voting on the water rates as opposed to like a regulator, there's sort of this political pressure that wouldn't be the case in the regulation. So I think it might be harder for systems to justify when rate increases are associated with infrastructure improvements or, you know, for environmental outcomes.
This issue is really going to come up very strongly in the second session, and I think there'll be a lot more debate about this. But Andreas, you're still here. You were going to have to go. I wonder if you want to weigh in on the issues of regulation and political control at that level versus local control.
Yes, as I said, I wait for the break. So as we are still here, so I can briefly comment on that. Thanks. Yes. In Germany, it works in the following way. First, the competition policy regimes are on the state level. So we have the federal level, the state level, and then we talk about the local governments and municipalities. So competition policy here is usually the state level, and these agencies are in fact a department in the Ministry for Economics Affairs at the state level. So it's not politically independent, but in its decision-making is dependent on the state level politics. But as we talk here about the municipalities, so really the local governments, I'd suggest that this is pretty independent of each other. No? So it may even be the federal level, but this is a very special instance, so I leave it here. It's a very special case. When it comes to communal supervision, I must admit that I'm not too sure right now where this is located. I have to check this again, but I guess I'm not so sure that this also belongs to some kind of upper level government structure type and tends to be, but I'm careful here, independent, but I'm a bit reluctant to make this point too strong because I have to check on this issue as well. Again, but as I said, competition policy, state level, well, not independent of politics, but as it's on a different level, I'd suggest that it's pretty independent.
So I'd like to suggest to you all that this is a topic for a future special issue, and I think utilities policy would be extremely interested in it, unpacking the politics, the regulation, the issue of control and ownership type. That's what came clear to me in the editorial overview when I was doing this, that those are the next questions. So I invite you to consider to think about those and how your work might fit and make propositions to the journal. What I'd like to suggest now is we take a 5-minute break and come back in about 5 minutes because it's different times in different parts of the world. And then we'll go with the second session where we actually do get more into these political issues. Tom Hanna has put an issue in the chat and he'll be the lead off paper in the second session. So Thomas, I'll let you bring that up then. And Caitlin has also put a note in the chat about our public utility commissions here in the US, and it's really hard for citizens to engage, which is certainly true. And she'll also be presenting in the second half along with Carlos and Renan. So thanks everyone, this has been great, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Thank you, bye-bye. I say bye-bye, sorry for leaving.
Hi guys, so nice to see you again. Now I see that Thomas doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation. No worries, Thomas. It's good to see you, guy, and feel free to make your comments and present your paper.
Great. Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm really, really enjoying all of the presentations. Apologies for not having a PowerPoint presentation, as I mentioned, but just really excited to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. My name is Thomas Hanna, and with David McDonald from Queen's University in Canada, I co-wrote the paper From Pragmatic to Politicized, the Future of Water Remunicipalization in the United States. David is teaching today, unfortunately, and was unable to join us, so I'm going to be presenting in his place. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about myself so you can get a sense as to who I am and where I was coming from when I was helping to put this paper together. I'm the research director at the Democracy Collaborative and vice president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives, both of which are research institutions based in the United States focused on building a more democratic, equitable, reparative, and sustainable political economic system. A big part of my day job is looking at how to scale up, modernize, and support organizations and enterprises that have more democratic models of ownership. So things like cooperatives, community land trusts, publicly owned enterprises, community development corporations, social enterprise, and so on and so forth. In recent years, I've really been focusing a lot on public ownership. And by this, I personally mean enterprises, services, and assets that are owned collectively by all people in a given geographic area and managed either directly through commons-based approaches or indirectly through various state agencies or bodies. And in 2018, I wrote a book on this subject called Our Commonwealth, The Return of Public Ownership in the United States, which was published by Manchester University Press. And the book looked at the relatively surprising scope, scale, and resiliency of public ownership in the United States, despite decades of privatization pressure, and delved into some of the reasons why that might be the case. One such area in the United States that has a relatively high density of public ownership compared to some other countries is water, which obviously I'll be talking about quite a bit more in a few minutes. I'm also about halfway through a part-time PhD program at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, with my dissertation focusing specifically on developing new, more democratic and participatory models of public ownership. So that brings me finally to our paper. In my experience, there's been a pretty significant uptick in interest, discussion, and activism around public ownership in recent years, especially since the financial crisis and the Great Recession of the late 2000s. In the United States, we've seen public banking, for instance, move from pretty much complete obscurity 15 years ago to a major broad-based social movement and progressive priority with active campaigns and legislative success in dozens of cities and states, California. We've also seen public power movements sprout up in a number of communities, with environmental activists in particular looking to bring electric utilities into public ownership as part of the effort to fight against climate change. And we've seen hundreds of municipalities start their own public broadband internet networks, often with the stated rationale that local public enterprise can deliver these services in a more affordable, equitable, and accountable way than the giant private telecoms corporations. Moreover, in a lot of these campaigns and efforts, there's a pretty explicit focus on moving beyond the traditional models of public ownership, both in terms of governance and objectives. And you can see this pretty clearly in the California public banking efforts. They're talking much more about how to set up much more democratic and participatory governance structures for their new banks. So what about water? The basic question that we wanted to investigate in this paper is whether we might expect to see a similar increase in pro-public organizing, campaigning, and messaging in the US water sector in the coming period. And to do so, we started by looking at the history of the US water sector as it relates to different ownership types and the motivations for shifts in ownership. And we suggested there are roughly 4 distinguishable eras in US history with regards to water. And first, you have the era of largely private provision in the 1800s, as small and large firms began to provide a variety of services to support the productive and consumptive needs of the growing working and middle class, things like water, transportation, electricity, gas, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And this was followed by a nationwide trend in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to municipalize such services, either by way of taking control of existing private operators or by establishing new publicly owned enterprises. In the water sector, this municipalization era saw hundreds of cities, including some of the largest cities in the country, like places like Baltimore, Chicago, Boston, LA, New York, Philly, San Francisco, so on and so forth, saw these communities taking their services into public ownership during this period. And the ideological motivations for municipalization during this time were pretty diverse, but there was generally an anti-monopoly and anti-corporate sentiment that was commonplace at the time. And there was a general feeling that local government could provide certain services like water more effectively, more affordably, and more equitably than the private sector. The third era, what we dubbed the sort of re-privatization era, began in the 1970s and corresponds to the rise and spread of neoliberalism, and driven in part, at least in part, by a new ecosystem of corporate funded think tanks, lobbyists, media outlets, and so on. Policymakers at various levels of government in the United States and around the world began to turn against public ownership and advocate for the privatization of a wide variety of public services and institutions. Interestingly, though, as far as the domestic economy goes, the United States actually did not embrace privatization to the same degree as some of its international contemporaries that had more centralized political systems. And I'm thinking specifically here about the UK, where pretty much everything that wasn't nailed down was kind of sold off. US policymakers, even people like Ronald Reagan, were somewhat lukewarm about privatization, especially at the local level. And privatization in the US most often takes the form of a contractual model, with outright asset sales to the private sector being relatively rare in the US. Water services in the US are reflective of these broader trends, with the 1990s and the early 2000s witnessing increased involvement by private companies, however, largely in the form of contracting and leasing. So this brings us up roughly to modern times. And before I move on to the fourth era, the remunicipalization era, I think it's important to take stock of what the water sector looks like in the United States in terms of ownership. And so despite nearly 50 years of privatization pressure, the overwhelming majority of Americans still receive their water from a publicly owned utility. As of the first quarter of 2021, it was approximately 87.3% of Americans who get their water from a community-owned system, get it from a publicly owned entity. That excludes, the trailer parks, the things that we were hearing about in California earlier, the small localities. Only 12.7% of Americans receive their water from a privately owned utility. And again, most of these are located in those smaller rural communities. And this also includes public-private partnerships. And there appears to be, I think, at least two interconnected reasons why public ownership remains dominant in the US water sector. And the first is that there's very little demand to privatize water utilities. And this is evidenced by some of the polling data that we presented in the paper, referendum results from some of the cases where water privatization has gone to a community vote, and growing efforts by water companies to avoid community votes at all costs when they want to privatize water. Second is the performance of the private operators themselves. And in many cases, has been relatively suboptimal in some pretty high profile cases. And this, along with sort of general performance record of privatization in other sectors, has really reinforced, I think, some of the fears in communities that privatization will lead to higher prices, lower quality, and a loss of decision-making power. And so that, I think, is a good segue to the fourth era we describe in the paper. And before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that this entire concept of defined historical eras is pretty murky to begin with. And when we wrote this paper, David and I were pretty well aware that there's a lot of conflicting data and opinions as to whether or not there is actually an identifiable trend towards remunicipalization around the world or in the water sector specifically. It's also pretty important, I think, to note that in this paper, we're using a relatively broad definition of remunicipalization. And specifically for us, the most important elements of remunicipalization are first, that there's a change in ownership and control from a for-profit entity, for-profit private entity to a nonprofit public entity. And second, that the service or enterprise was at some point in the past owned or controlled by a public entity. And as such, we include services and enterprises that have been brought back into public hands, but maybe in a different form or structure from when they left private hands in the first place. So with all that being said, there are a few reasons why we believe that it's possible that the US water sector is moving out of a phase of privatization and into a phase of remunicipalization. And first is the simple fact that the vast majority of water utilities in the United States do remain publicly owned. And despite some year-to-year fluctuations, the percentage of Americans served by publicly owned systems is actually still generally higher than it was in the mid-2000s, and there are still numerically less privately owned systems. Second,
just letting you know you have 2 minutes left.
Oh man, that's that's not good. Okay, apologies for going so slowly. So I'm just going to skip a bunch of this stuff, and I'm just going to talk about our research, because we focus more on the qualitative nature of remunicipalizations rather than whether or not there are high numbers of them. And we wanted to establish if water municipalizations in the United States were primarily pragmatic or political in nature. And by pragmatic, we're referring here to relatively conventional decision-making that revolves around efficiency, cost savings, and service quality, rather than any philosophical objection to private sector participation in the water sector. And by political, we're talking about establishing and preserving local community control over a water system, as well as transforming what is to be expected from a public water operator, such as demands for better accountability, equity-oriented billing and rates, participatory decision-making, and the decommodification of water services in general. And in general, the literature we reviewed in the paper suggests that recent US experience with remunicipalization has largely been pragmatic, albeit with some notable exceptions. And to further investigate this dynamic, we analyzed all of the US water cases in a new remunicipalization database that has been developed by the Transnational Institute and researchers at the University of Glasgow. And there were 72 cases in this database, pretty evenly split between Republican and Democratic leaning states. We then, through a process of triangulation with available secondary literature from media and NGO reports, were able to develop a profile on 49 of those cases. And we found that the key actors involved in most of the decision-making in these cases were overwhelmingly elected officials and bureaucrats from relevant public authorities. And the vast majority of stated rationales were around high cost and poor performance. Only 3 cases cited local control or transparency as a rationale, and only 6 cases indicated active participation by residents, activists, or unions. Based on this assessment, we suggest that around 42 of those cases appear to be pragmatic in orientation, while around only 7 appear to be clearly politicized remunicipalizations. And I think we need to be very, very cautious about this analysis due to the lack of detail in the database, as well as a lot of ambiguity about this concept of pragmatic versus political. But I do think it reinforces what's in the literature about the nature of US remunicipalizations. So where does that lead us and where are we going? Are we likely to see more politicized water remunicipalizations in the coming period, similar to what's happening in other parts of the world and other sectors in the US? We suggest it could go both ways, so a very unsatisfactory answer, so apologies for that. But first and foremost, we do see a growing public frustration with economic and racial inequality in water services. You can see that with Flint, Michigan, the millions of people who are exposed to unsafe drinking water in the United States, mostly from disenfranchised communities of color or other marginalized groups. We also see water services becoming more unaffordable for millions of people, as well as water cutoffs and service interruptions happening, especially impacting communities of color and low-income groups.
Okay, sorry for interrupt you, Guy, but we have to move to the questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Thomas. And people, if you have one quick question from the audience, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Kyle.
I guess I don't know, my prompt, I don't know if it's a question or comment, is if, the first wave of municipalization in the US, at least in the American South, was characterized by underbounding of communities of color. And I'm wondering, particularly with what you were just talking about, if any progress on that has been made with this remunicipalization era, or if similar dynamics might come to be at play.
Sure, yeah. So I think in some places, places like Atlantic City just had a big anti-privatization fight that included a very broad diversity of local community stakeholders, unions, the NAACP, other groups that were involved there. I think you're starting to see, and I think part of what I had to sort of skip over is I think you're starting to see more discussion around incorporating equity concerns into remunicipalization and anti-privatization fights. And I think that's one way or one piece of evidence that we're looking at that is suggesting that there might be a trend towards more politicized, more pro-public forms of remunicipalization in the coming period. But there are a lot of headwinds against that as well, which I obviously didn't have time to get into. So I wouldn't put too much stock into that, but I do think we are starting to see some of that in the United States.
Good. I'd like to make one question, but it's a bit longer, so I would like to make it in the end. Now we can move to the next presenter, who is Professor Mildred Warner.
Thank you very much, Renan. And what I'd like to talk about, I wrote the editorial overview to this, but also in that editorial overview, I put some data in about what's happening in the US. And since these first 3 papers in this afternoon session are about the US, I will speak to that. So in order to look at trends in water privatization in the US, I have been working with the International City County Management Institute, and we run surveys every 5 years of all cities and counties in the US. And we pair surveys across any 2 5-year periods to ask, is the service, was it public before and is it public now, 5 years later? Was it a contract before? Is it a contract now? So that would be stable contracting. Was it public before and now it's a contract? That would be new contracting out. And was it contracted out before and now it's public? And that would be contracting back in, which might be thought of as reverse privatization or remunicipalization. And what you see is it's a pendulum swing. And while most water in the US is delivered by stable public contracts, there is a small level of stable private delivery, about 16%, but the pendulum is sort of sitting here in the middle, a little bit toward new contracts, a little bit toward reversals. So not a trend, but really just a wiggling of the dial. And if you look at the data, I bring you here data over 3 different time periods for both water distribution and water treatment. And what you'll see is that stable public delivery is on a slight decline. Stable contracting is on a slight increase. And new contracting out and contracting back in, or remunicipalization, are about equal. Now, the way that, why would this be true? We asked some questions on the survey for why did you bring work back in-house? And the primary reasons are quality and cost. Then we also have improved efficiency, a successful proposal by in-house staff, and strong support, political support to bring the work back in. And then the least common answers are the ones that come from what we call transaction cost theory, which is the issue of what's the level of competition, problems with contract monitoring, and contract specification. But most of the literature on reverse privatization or remunicipalization in the US has taken a transaction cost approach, looking at this issues of competition and cost of contract management and monitoring. And ours paper back in 2004 was the first empirical paper in the US to look at these issues. And indeed, we found support for the transaction cost perspective. But then when we did the next analysis on the next 2 years of data, we discovered much more involvement of citizen interest. So maybe this is a little bit of a move toward a political process, Tom, not clear. But what we've really seen in most of our work is this issue of pragmatic municipalism, not progressive, just pragmatic, where local government managers are trying to balance the service cost and quality, those 2 primary concerns, with citizen interest and with political interest. And we also saw this earlier in Andreas' paper on Germany, where political interests were there, but they weren't real strong. What we're seeing a lot of is market management, and the fact that if you want to have competition in the market, since really a water provider, it's competition for the market, but there's no competition once you go private. It's substituting one monopoly for another. And so you have competition over time through instability in your contracts, contracting in, contracting out, contracting back in. And then more recently, with the more recent data since the Great Recession, we have not seen an increase in privatization. But we've seen an effort on the parts of local governments to balance need and fiscal stress with service delivery alternatives. And one of the alternatives that's very popular are various forms of inter-municipal cooperation. And these get confused in the Glasgow T&I database on remunicipalization. And so we're not differentiating private versus public, they get put in together. And then finally, we were able to look at the level of unionization to wonder, this was a question that I think was asked by Caitlin earlier of Gabriella. And so we measured the level of unionization in a local government to ask if this has an effect on the levels of new contracting out or the contracting back in. And we find that governments with higher levels of unionization have lower rates of contracting back in or remunicipalization. Well, this seems strange. It seems like the opposite of what you would expect. But what it suggests is that unions force governments to manage better because there's less slack and they're paying attention. And indeed, we see that the monitoring rates of contracts are much higher. So if contracting is going to work, you've got to monitor it really closely, and unions might be groups forcing local government managers to manage better. But there's some limits to this pragmatic municipalism, because as the water sector is taken over more by private equity, this makes it more difficult for local governments to even bring their water back. In the case of Missoula, Montana, which was never public, it's always been private, they tried to bring the water back in under public control. So it's not back in, it's a new municipalization. And what happened is the cost, private equity keeps running up the cost of your system. So in order to buy it back, you're buying it back for 3 times what it was originally priced at. And as those costs, the acquisition cost and the legal costs rise over time, public support for the municipalization can drop. In the case of Missoula, Montana, the Public Utilities Commission and the judge had a major role in making it possible for the work to come back. And then I also want to point to some work that Gabriela de Amore, Marcela Gonzalez and Shui Zhang and Mary Grant from Food and Water Watch and I have been doing, looking at the 500 largest city water systems in the US, where again, we see that private is about $144 per year higher in price. But in states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where the regulatory structure has been captured in favor of private actors, private prices are another $87 a year higher. And some of the issues here are this idea of fair market value, which is actually valuing assets above their book value, which facilitates private interest in acquisitions, and also facilitates government interest in selling, because you can get more than the system is worth. And then the distribution system improvement charges, which are a way to add surcharges in between the rate case reviews by the Public Utilities Commission to help cover increased capital costs. And the argument here is that these forms of regulatory change, which we might say are also politicized, are actually setting the stage for potentially more private sector acquisition in the future. So with that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
Excellent paper and talk, Mildred. Thank you. So, questions from the audience? As Mildred was super efficient, we have a little bit more time now, like for 3 minutes.
Gabriela?
Everyone, thanks for letting me know about this, Mildred, and I'm happy that I joined in time to hear the presentation. I was interested in some of the trends that we've seen in other regions on the swing of the pendulum towards the private contracting has been able to isolate trends in terms of the change in the rate of water rates, but also has been able to identify a point at which there is no longer efficiency gains. And I was wondering within that, because you have such a rich data set that you're looking at in terms of across, I don't know what 9% means out of that 2,500, but it seems like it's a pretty good number. Have you noticed particular trends therein in terms of both the price increase in terms of water rates or water tariff increases, as well as any efficiency changes therein that are claimed? Because what we've seen in other regions, for example, is this kind of U curve where the price is going up and then all of a sudden the efficiencies are also increasing, but then there's a turn downwards after a certain price point. I don't know if that's a question.
There's in the morning sessions, we had papers, efficiency. How do you measure efficiency? There can be a whole set of questions around that. But in the morning, we had several papers, Gabriela looking at different kinds of ways to measure, and Kyle and Kira, I think she's gone off to teach. But I have 2 different data sets. One is, how is your service delivered? Public, private, intermunicipal? It's just a yes, no. I don't know anything else. Okay. And then we have the data that we've worked on with Food and Water Watch on water prices, but we don't actually have data on cost. And so one of the challenges is, what are the costs of the system? We controlled in this last model that I mentioned, we control for age of system, thinking that older systems, might have more issues, and indeed they do. So that's something, again, part of what we're doing in this seminar today is thinking about future research papers and things people are working on. It sounds like you're working on something that would be really important to include in a future utilities policy issue, because it sounds like you're able to get at those two questions.
Yeah, we're hoping to, and so that was, as you guessed, where my interest is, merging those two data sets essentially. Thanks.
That would be awesome and a great contribution to the literature.
Thanks.
So, Thomas.
Yeah, just a quick two-part question. First, do you have a sense that if you were able to remove the intermunicipal contracting, what that would do to the pendulum swing, and would there be more or less private contracting if you removed that? And I guess the second part of that question is in your estimation, do you consider the intermunicipal contracting to be a form of private contracting, or is that more like a public or some sort of public form of contracting?
So on the intermunicipal, the rates of reversals of contract, let's call a reversal a contract failure, right? You're not happy, so you bring the work back. The rates of reversals are much higher with for-profit contracts than with intermunicipal contracts. Once you go to the intermunicipal contracts are way more stable, so they would have lower rates of reverse privatization. But they raise similar issues of monitoring and accountability. And so in the first session, we talked about these special districts and who sits on the board and who has decision-making authority. And the problem with an intermunicipal contract is it's with your neighbor. They're not going away. You're stuck. And so you have low sanctioning power. And they also, they're a form of corporatization, if you think about it, because you're moving the authority to an appointed board, and it has less direct political connection to the municipality. And so intermunicipal cooperation has more public features for sure. And we see that in our work, but it also has accountability and monitoring issues that are maybe even more challenging than with some private contracts. But it does show more public, has more of a public value ethos sitting at its base. But I think there's a lot of work now going on in public administration on intermunicipal cooperation. But with that, I think my time's up, Renan, and we should probably move on to Caitlin.
Yeah, okay. We can talk a little bit more in the end. So Caitlin, feel free to share your screen if you have slides. Yes, she has. Okay.
All right. All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Caitlin Shoring. I have a PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm currently a postdoctoral associate at the Pittsburgh Water Collaboratory. And unfortunately, my co-author, Marcela Gonzalez-Rivas, had to leave. So I'll be presenting our paper, Pittsburgh's Translocal Social Movement, A Case of the New Public Water, today for the both of us. And I'm sorry, my slide is not advancing. There we go. So my plan for today is to just give very quickly a brief background on the Pittsburgh case, and then to situate it within the main literature we're engaging with, go over our research question and methods, and then kind of our main findings and conclusion. So just to give you context, so Pittsburgh is a mid-sized city of about 302,000 people in Pennsylvania. And there are within the city limits 4 main water providers. 3 of them are public, 1 is private. And you can see here the thick kind of solid black line, that's Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, or PWSA. And so what I'm talking about today is involving that service provider, which is the largest. It serves about 83,000 people. So pre-2012, PWSA was plagued with various problems, including problems with their billing, overbilling, horrible customer service, and they were in debt, a story that's not that uncommon to many utilities, especially in the face of austerity and lack of investment in public infrastructure. So as a solution to their problems, PWSA sought to enter into a P3 contract or public-private partnership with the transnational water firm Veolia. And so in the contract, it stipulated that Veolia would get to keep up to 50 cents for every dollar it saved. And the hope was that they would get the authority in shape. But various changes were made under Veolia's management, including a lot of layoff of staff, including lab staff. And also there was a corrosion control switch that happened to save cost, but it happened illegally without going through the proper channels to get approval from the state Department of Environmental Protection. That whole story is very complicated in terms of where the blame should go. And so I'm going to leave it at that for this, but happy to come back to it. Shortly after the contract was terminated in 2016, news broke that there were elevated lead levels in the water. And there were various other water quality problems. This led to a citizen lawsuit. It led to PWSA, then suing Veolia, and then Veolia countering back, saying we're not to blame. Ultimately, that was settled out of court, but the PWSA was actually placed under the Public Utility Commission PUC oversight, which doesn't typically happen for a public utility. And that has also brought additional, I guess we could say both pros and cons, which I'm also happy to return to. In 2018, there was an effort, a proposal for People's Gas, which is a private local gas company, to create a new public-private partnership. It was going to be called People's Water, and seeking this out to kind of address the problems that PWSA was facing, especially with lead and needing to replace lead lines. And just as a quick side note, People's Gas has since been acquired by Aqua America, which is one of the largest US-based water firms. At this point, actually in 2017, so when news of the lead crisis broke, a coalition formed called Our Water Campaign, which was, it's a coalition of environmental justice, community, labor, racial and gender justice activists who were very clear in articulating that the solution from their perspective was not another public-private partnership, that had caused or certainly contributed to the problems the city was in, and that the solution wasn't to turn to another one. But Our Water Campaign was also very much pushing forward the idea that our water should be clean, it should be safe, it should be affordable. The lead problem needed to be addressed, but it should remain public. And so now I just want to give a little bit of background or situate it with the main literature we're engaging in. So there's the water governance literature that, as we've already heard today, right, that US remunicipalization efforts have tended to be more pragmatic in nature rather than political. Also, the literature showing that social movements push for kind of reconceptualizing what we mean by public water, pushing for accountability, equity, more transparent and participatory governance. And in the social movement literature, there is this idea of what we could call translocal activism or translocal learning networks that is basically saying movements are rooted in place, so in a very local place like Pittsburgh, for example, and fighting for a local problem and with local targets like the city council or mayor or the local water authority board. But that they're also engaging with people, with markets, with the state, with corporations, with other social movement activists. And they're specifically engaging with other social movement activists who are advocating for a similar thing. So in this case, public, clean, affordable water around the country and around the world, and they're learning and connecting with each other what strategies work. But it also is it is political in the sense that it's coming from this idea that water should be viewed more as held in the public trust, viewed as a commons, right, and not a commodity. So our research question is, what is the role of social movements in preventing water privatization in Pittsburgh? It's based on qualitative data. My co-author conducted interviews. I've been a part of and involved with our water campaign and done ethnographic work since its inception in 2017. And we also drew on various secondary sources, and happy to talk more about that also in the Q&A. In sum, though, what we found is that in the case of Pittsburgh, that social movement pressure really did prevent another public-private partnership. This potential PPP could have occurred at various points, most notably with the People's Gas proposal, that local government officials, including city council, including the mayor, would articulate that they were against privatization, but it became clear that public-private partnership wasn't included in their definition of what privatization was. But our water campaign and other allied groups really kind of pushed back against that and defining what constitutes privatization and saying, well, actually, the research and experiences show that often, especially in the case of water, PPP is the worst form of privatization because it turns all the risk over to the public side and all the profit or all of the risk to the public side and all of the profit to the private, right? And so our water campaign really pushed this engagement in two main ways. So one was organizing the public, organizing activists to place specific demands on PWSA to make the changes it needed to make, but also working with public officials by attending board meetings, by attending city council meetings, individual meetings, public actions to find ways to push changes forward, acknowledging that PWSA needed to improve things, but also articulating we want the authority to stay public. And so some of the organizing wins that occurred during this time included that our water campaign was able to push for PWSA to stop partial lead line replacements, which are known to throw more lead into the system, to work to both find funding and have a commitment to full lead line replacements. And they're on track to have all of the lead lines replaced by, the goal is 2026, but also putting in place more customer assistance programs, because there was an understanding that rate increases had to happen in order to make these infrastructure improvements, but that the burden shouldn't fall on those who are already most vulnerable. So that also included pushing for the implementation of a winter shutoff on winter moratorium on shutoffs. And this was pre-COVID-19 when they're, with the federal moratoriums that were put in place. And also advocating that this, that work and improvements, infrastructure improvements be done in a more sustainable way, pushing for green infrastructure. I think there's been less progress made there, but next year, actually, a stormwater fee will be implemented after many years of pushing for that on the end of on the part of campaigns and social movements. So just as one quick example of what one of these trainings might look like is World Water Day 2019. Our water campaign held a community training where people came. They learned about the history of PWSA and challenges about the Veolia P3, what that meant, what that looked like, articulated why this wasn't, another P3 shouldn't be the solution for the city's problems, and then actually did, over the course of the next week, lobby visits with local officials and asking them to sign this pledge. And to the surprise of many, the mayor actually signed it, kind of reversing his previous statements about being pro-PPP. And a couple months later, the PWSA board also passed, signed on to this pledge, committing to keep the water public and to invest in green infrastructure, workforce development to create quality jobs. And so ultimately what we argue is that the Pittsburgh mobilization is an important case. It illustrates that there are political aspects fighting against water privatization in the US context, and that social movements were really critical, not just in saying we want to keep the water public, but articulating what that looks like, because just because an authority is public doesn't mean it's going to have transparent, democratic governance. So really pushing for and shaping, what that new public water looks like. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And thanks for also bringing out a case where we have explicit political and social mobilization. I'd like to open it to the audience for questions. Tom.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. Could you maybe just speak a little bit more about what the very last thing that you spoke about in terms of the demands with regards to governance, and maybe what the campaign was asking for with regards to new governance structures?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And it might be helpful. I didn't want to share this because there wasn't time. So this is a table that we include in our paper, but I think, so what it looked like in terms of demands of governance is really holding PWSA, the Water Authority, accountable to making the changes that needed to happen. So people, would organize to show up to the PWSA board meetings, but also there were public actions held. So a lot of community participation, and you can see like over here we have in the characteristics of the new public water conceptualization. So that idea of resident or citizen engagement. There were a series of blue ribbon panels that also had happened to discuss potentially restructuring the authority, and P3 was on the table for that, showing up and giving public comment and really articulating and actually handing a proposal for what our water campaign says the water authority should look like. And so I think it took place in various ways, but ultimately the idea that like decisions shouldn't be happening behind closed doors. They need to be happening visibly, right? And also that if there's commitments made to do something, those have to be followed through on. So you can't just say you're going to implement a customer assistance program and then not do it, or that you're going to replace the lead lines, but not have a plan to do it. So just kind of constantly, I think there were a lot of people within the authority and local public officials who wanted to work with our water campaign. And it was kind of a carrot stick approach, right? Working with them, but also holding them accountable to not just say the right thing, but to do it. I hope that starts to answer your question.
Do we have another question for Caitlin? Yes, Gabriela.
Thank you, Caitlin, for your presentation. I thought the paper was great, and I was just interested in what you thought was perhaps the most effective of strategies that were employed, because it seems like, for example, partnering with Our River was really, Our River's campaign, I believe, was really critical to, the complementary types of social movements, and that as a strategy that could potentially travel. So what, from your assessment, did you feel is perhaps the most effective of strategies that were employed by our water campaign?
Yeah, and I think, also probably what was effective here, might not necessarily be effective in the same way somewhere else, right? Because each locality has distinct differences. But I do think something that made our water campaign effective and is that the broad coalition of different groups, right? So mainstream, what we would call like mainstream environmental groups, like the Sierra Club, right? Local chapter, working for women's health and reproductive justice, having an environmental justice and racial justice lens, organizations working on labor issues, right? And also framing this as that this is an environmental problem. It's also, it's about workers' rights also, and building that kind of broader alliance. So that ties into then, so saying we need lead lines replaced, or we need to implement a stormwater fee, understanding that rate increases have to happen because of that, but working to make sure that's done in an equitable way, but also pushing for kind of workforce development, prioritizing hot union jobs, that all ties together. Now, all of that didn't fall together perfectly, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think that kind of, we could call it like almost a cross-sector alliance, and doing a lot of community, canvassing, talking to people about what the problems they were experiencing, and engaging the community in this work is what really, I think, made it effective.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll let you answer in the chat because we now need to move on. I'd like you to stop sharing your screen and Renan can start. We're now going to move to Latin America with papers by Renan and Carlos looking at Brazil and Uruguay. So Renan, take it away.
Okay, so can you see my screen? Right? Okay, so here's the paper co-authored with Lucas, who is not here because he's working right now. And our paper copes with the question of governance, thinking about a state government which face austerity pressures, which I'll explain in a minute, and the financialization from private shareholders. So basically, our paper here has a traditional literature reveal data methods and finds typical structure. And the key idea here in the introduction is that one that resembles with what Mildred and Tom have just said of distinctive waves of what we call regulatory regimes, which reach subnational governments, ownership structures, which respond to these international or national waves and try to adapt it. So in this lens, we think about the so-called Fordist Keynesian or developmentalist era in which governments look to create or take back in-house services, while neoliberalization brought about outsourcing and privatization. In the case of Brazil, we don't see any of these clear waves. We see, on one hand, a global movement or a specific movement from multinational outsourced services in the early 20th century to deprivatization after the 1940s, to be followed by privatization again after the 80s. In the 1990s, thinking specifically about the water and sanitation sector, we saw social movements that avoided privatization in this sector. And after that, progressive governments pushed back privatization in the 2000s. For example, you'll see a little bit more of it, I think, in the Carlos Santos next paper. Since 2014, in Brazil specifically, national conservative governments have been pushing local governments for privatization. So in Brazil, you have the federal government, the state level, and then municipalities or local governments. In our case study here, we are talking about one specific state, which is the state of Minas Gerais, the second largest state in Brazil, and the state-owned company, which is called Copasa. Copasa was created in 63, 64, and since 2006, it is a mixed company mode of privatization, which was done through the IPO, initial public offer of its shares. So since then, the state government holds a little more than 50% of its shares, while private investors, mostly international banks and investment funds, for example, the UBS bank based on Swiss, holds the other 49% of the shares. By 2000, the Copasa offers drinking water to more than half of the population of the state, which means almost 11.5 million people. And it offers full sewage services, collected and treated by nearly 40% or almost 9 million people of the Minas Gerais population. Part of this contract is not fully operated, although nearly 60% doesn't have full sewage services due to the lack of investments. However, the company is quite profitable. In the next years, in the last years, since 2018, several extraordinary dividends payouts were made by the company. So what does explain this governance mode? This is the key question of our paper. Here you can see a broad view of the regional action of the company. You see the state in Brazil, and then you see each polygonal here, it's a municipality. You see water in blue, water and sewage in yellow, and the white ones are the non-operated municipalities. Our hypothesis here is that the state government, shrinking by austerity measures, opted to increase extraordinarily dividend distributions in order to raise its own revenues, which led to lower investments. Private shareholders, especially financial markets, endorsed this burden of governance motivated by a short financial logic, what we call financialization. Well, we are basing both in quantitative and qualitative research, specifically financial corporate data publicly available to us, as well as semi-structured interviews with key actors. We talked with corporate managers, very top ex-corporate managers like the ex-CEO and the ex-CFO of Copasa, regulators, current officers and ex-officers. I'm among them. I mean, I was a former regulator in the state, and private consultants in the private sector. And then look at the data, we see that indeed the company has been quite profitable. Here you see the revenue, which is constantly increasing. And it's the second picture. You can see the level, the blue line, the ratio between investment and profit. And in the orange line, you can see the dividend profit ratio. What you can clearly see is that since the government started to clearly talk about austerity, the level of investment compared with the level of profit dropped significantly. There were official declaration of it since 2016. The state of Minas Gerais, which holds half of the company, told the situation of financial calamity. They used that word, financial calamity, to name austerity. And when you talk with the key managers and former regulators, they clearly state that. They also told us that then, of course, if the state decides to anticipate profitability instead of invest, what they, financial investors, would do, they got it, right? Here I'm quoting all the interviews, okay? So the second one says, when it decided that the company was going to generate cash, surplus cash, that there was no way to invest it because of the pressures of austerity, the private partners start to push for dividends. And the government want easy money. So the private shareholders also endorsed this form of governance. This created an interesting view to the privatization motives or incentives that private sector has, especially when it is financial actors. Since in a fully privatized model, they will have full control of the firm. So that's it for now. Thank you, guys.
Well, you really went quickly, so we have plenty of time for questions for Renan, and you've brought up the issue of finance and financial interest of both the public actor and the private actor. I would like to see if anyone in the audience has questions for Renan. Gabriela.
Sorry, I have many questions. I have a doctoral student who's looking at this issue across Brazil, so I'm super interested in what you're saying, and the fact that you were a regulator yourself brings even more interest to what you were witnessing, in short. So, I mean, given that Copasa still had the majority share, no? The state still had the majority share in Copasa. So what was the benefit? Why could they not invest? I mean, I know that you're talking about fiscal austerity in this particular moment, but there were also pressures still with all of the sanitation law reforms that have been happening over that, or the pushes for sanitation law. There seems to be a bigger story there politically, and I'm interested in perhaps if you got a sense of why specifically Copasa felt that it could not invest further, even within a realm of austerity. Thank you.
Okay, so the basic answer to these questions, I believe, is that when, let us say, Copasa profits 1 billion, let us say, for a year. If the government decides to not invest and distribute all the profit among government and private shareholders, it means that the government will have in its own cash 500 million that year. If the government decides to invest, it will take a long way to see the payback of this investment. As sanitation is not a political priority, they prefer to have cash right now and use this cash for other purposes, health, security, education, which is more clearly easy to see for the general public than investing in like a sewage treatment plant, which nobody sees where it is. It's just below the solid ground. And the interviews clearly show that they really prefer to have cash right now instead of waiting for the benefits of sanitation.
Fascinating. Infrastructure is invisible. That's, I think, part of the problem there. Did you have a second question, Gabriela?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, I mean, Copasa is separate still, no? It's not its budget is its own budget, and unless you're saying it goes back to Minas Gerais. And so I have 20 billion questions for Renan, so I will ask you afterwards so you can continue. Like Tom continue.
Yeah, but you're right. It has a separate budget, but the final result, the profit, is 51% state government, 49% private sector.
Okay, Tom and Caitlin both have questions. Tom?
Caitlin can go before me, and if we still have time, I'll go after.
Okay, Caitlin.
Well, I guess I have a theme here today, but I'm curious about how all of this intersects with unions. And I'm thinking specifically, because I also do work in Brazil, and I'm more familiar with like Sabesp in Sao Paulo, and you know, how in the case of in Minas Gerais, are unions also an active presence within the water and sanitation company? If so, you know, are they shaping any of this discourse around financialization and privatization, or not really?
Good question, Caitlin. Indeed, the union sector is the key oppositor to this partner of governance. So they created a small institution to try specifically to avoid privatization across Brazil, not only Minas Gerais. You can find a lot more about it. It's called ONDAS, which is the National Observatory about Water and Sanitation, which makes a lot of conference, organized workshops with local managers to try to avoid privatization in the state level, here in Minas Gerais, as well as in São Paulo with Sabesp, and Paraná with Sanepar, etc. So yeah, there's a lot of pressure from the workers to avoid privatization. They have been the weaker part of the story so far. We're not seeing their wins up to now.
Great. And Tom?
Apologies, sorry. Yeah, I had a very similar question. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the government structure of the utility and whether or not there was involvement by different stakeholder groups with utility, and also given the sort of, I guess, the scale, if I'm correct, it sounds like this is a large scale utility. So how does that work with the sort of local communities that it serves? What's the balance there? And then just very lastly, I know, or I vaguely remember that in Porto Alegre, there was some participatory budgeting with regards to the water utility there at some point in time. I was wondering if there had been any sort of discussion with this utility about using participatory budgeting techniques to determine how to spend some of that revenue into the local community.
Nice question, Tom. Indeed, Copasa was created during the dictatorship in Brazil in the 60s, so there's no participatory budget at all. On contrary, what we see in the company, it's a very centralized model of governance where all the strategic actions are planned in the capital city, Belo Horizonte, and where the smaller municipalities are left behind. So the company has operational structures in all the entire territory. However, the decisions are really highly centralized in the headquarters.
Great. Thank you very much, Renan. And now we turn our attention to Uruguay. And Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mildred. Hello to everyone. Thanks to Renan and Mildred for organizing this webinar. I need to apologize, but I'm going to talk in Spanish. And I put my main ideas on a few slides to share with you, but I'm going to talk in Spanish. And at first, and previous information, we have in Uruguay one only national public utility on water distribution and water treatment called OSE, OSI, Obras Sanitarias del Estado. So, en el inicio de la presentación quería discutir con ustedes algunas de los antecedentes que llevan el escenario actual y reconocer ahí que hay una sólida movilización antineoliberal en el año 2004 que coloca en la constitución del país, por vía de la iniciativa popular, los principios de transparencia, participación y equidad en el acceso al agua, que sin embargo han sido dejados de lado, han sido olvidados en la gestión pública que ha sucedido luego de esa aprobación. La transición de los gobiernos neoliberales a los gobiernos progresistas que tuvimos en el país entre 2005 y 2020 perpetuó algunos de los elementos más injustos de la estructura tarifaria. Por ejemplo, los sectores de menores ingresos pagan un precio relativo más caro por el agua que los sectores de altos ingresos, y el aumento del costo de la tarifa que se ha generado a partir de la contaminación del agua en las diferentes cuencas hidrográficas no se ha visto acompañada con un control de esas actividades, lo cual genera una lógica de subsidios sociales a los procesos de contaminación. Y si bien la cobertura en el acceso al agua potable en el país ha sido alta históricamente, eso se ha convertido en un problema en los últimos años, pero por lo que tiene que ver con la calidad del agua distribuida por esta contaminación que les mencionaba, sobre todo en la región sur del país, en los departamentos más poblados, en Montevideo, la capital, pero también en Maldonado y Canelones, donde han quedado en evidencia serios problemas de potabilización del agua de OSE, de esta compañía nacional. Este proceso que llamamos reestatización, por tratarse de una sola empresa que tiene cobertura en todo el país, duró 15 años, todo el ciclo de gobiernos neoliberales entre 2005 y 2020, a través de una modalidad particular por la cual el Estado uruguayo fue comprando las acciones de empresas multinacionales, manteniendo la lógica de asociaciones público-privadas con uno de los accionistas principales hasta el año 2019, cuando expiró el último contrato vigente. Pero además, el Estado uruguayo no restableció la gestión de esa zona privatizada del país a la empresa nacional, sino que creó una nueva figura llamada Unidad de Gestión Descentralizada, que opera bajo la lógica privada, pero que sigue siendo propiedad en su mayoría de OCE, junto con el gobierno municipal del departamento de Maldonado. En lo que tiene que ver con la estructura tarifaria y con estas injusticias que se sostienen desde el momento neoliberal, un primer punto ahí a destacar es en el año 2007, cuando se incluye en el cargo fijo de la tarifa de agua un volumen de agua mucho mayor, que antes estaba considerado en el cargo variable. Esto afecta a los hogares más pobres, ya que tienen que destinar una mayor cantidad de sus ingresos para cubrir la tarifa de agua en términos relativos con los hogares de los sectores económicamente más pudientes. Pero por otra parte, 10 años después, en 2017, se introduce dentro de la tarifa de agua potable una tasa ambiental, un impuesto ambiental, que busca cubrir el aumento del costo de la potabilización. Pero esto lo que genera es esta lógica que decíamos de los subsidios sociales a la contaminación, ya que quienes cubren el costo del deterioro del agua en las cuencas de origen son los usuarios del sistema público y no las empresas o los actores productivos que contaminan. ¿Qué está pasando en la actualidad? Bueno, estamos en un contexto de transición, de finalización de los gobiernos progresistas y de la emergencia de una nueva generación de gobiernos conservadores que abren nuevas cuestiones para la gestión de la empresa pública de agua y su carácter público. Primero que nada, hay un elemento que está actualmente en discusión, porque fue aprobado por el Parlamento una ley que transfiere el poder de la definición de las tarifas del agua potable para todo el país de la OCE, de la empresa nacional, a una unidad reguladora creada en la década de los 90, durante el periodo neoliberal. Esa ley actualmente está siendo llevada a referéndum, hay una campaña de movilización nacional que lo que hace es tratar de derogar esta ley que actualmente se encuentra en vigencia. O sea, el ente público ya no tiene la capacidad de la determinación de las tarifas. Pero el segundo elemento, que es el más preocupante a nuestro entender, es que hay anunciadas una gran cantidad de inversiones de un monto muy importante, aproximadamente $1.000 millones, en plantas de tratamiento de agua y en plantas de potabilización de agua que se propone manejar a través de la iniciativa de capital privado, con financiamiento de instituciones financieras internacionales y con gestión privada, lo cual está explícitamente prohibido por la Constitución de la República. Entonces, en términos de cuáles son las principales preguntas que tenemos abiertas en la gestión del agua en Uruguay, en primer lugar, la pregunta principal tiene que ver con cómo este proceso de transición de empresas privatizadas a empresas públicas que ha sucedido durante los gobiernos progresistas mantiene elementos neoliberales extremadamente regresivos en la lógica de la gestión pública. Entonces ahí nos preguntamos si es válido mantener el antagonismo público-privado como oposiciones binarias para analizar la dinámica de los servicios esenciales, como es el agua potable. El debate en Uruguay, que llevan adelante los operadores políticos y los tomadores de decisión, corre el riesgo de descuidar una serie de grises, de escalas, de matices que existen en la discusión sobre cómo sostener, mejorar y expandir el acceso de las personas al servicio del agua potable. Por otro lado, las principales demandas de la reforma constitucional del año 2004 fueron dejadas por el camino. La gestión transparente, la participación, la fiscalización pública, la gestión del agua a través de las cuencas hidrográficas como unidad básica, no se han incluido en ningún aspecto en las dinámicas de gestión de la empresa de agua potable. Sí existen políticas nacionales de agua que atienden estos elementos, pero funcionan en paralelo a la gestión de la OCE, de la Empresa Nacional de Agua. Y por otro lado, también en esta discusión binaria se han perdido los matices de otras formas de privatización, que más allá o diferentes de la venta completa de las empresas, que tienen que ver con la descentralización, la tercerización y la injerencia del sector privado en áreas centrales de la compañía, pero manteniendo la propiedad pública del servicio. Gracias.
Muy interesante. Gracias por esta presentación y también ha terminado con minutos que sobran. Entonces ya voy a abrir la discusión para algunas preguntas que alguien puede tener. And we can ask the questions in English or in Spanish. Gabriela.
Gracias, Carlos. Quiero saber si es la proporción o es la proporción del ingreso de la gente que tienen que pagar más, o es más que lo que pagan es más alto de la otra comunidad, porque lo que no entendí es cómo es que ellos están pagando más, porque lo sabemos en otros lugares donde hay la bomba que están usando porque el volumen que sale es más, entonces lo que pagan es más. Pero donde estás hablando es en un área rural, es un área urbano, no hay que ser con la tecnología, ¿no? Es más la proporción. ¿O no?
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. En realidad, en términos reales, pagan lo mismo. El costo de la tarifa es el mismo, pero en términos relativos con el ingreso promedio de los hogares pobres destinan una proporción mucho más alta de su ingreso para pagar la tarifa de agua de la que destinan los hogares más ricos. No hay una política diferenciada de tarifas, y eso es grave en términos de acceso justo al servicio.
Lo que me interesaba a mí son las áreas gris en cuanto a la regulación, en cuanto al doñazgo. ¿Y puede explicar un poco más sobre qué es URSEA? ¿Es agencia reguladora? ¿Qué es?
La URSEA es la Unidad Reguladora de los Servicios de Energía y Agua Potable. Fue creada en la década de los 90, cuando todo el sector de empresas públicas estaba siendo abierto a la privatización. Entonces, como parte de las recomendaciones de los organismos financieros internacionales, se sugería la creación de agencias que regularan las tarifas de los servicios. Lo que es un poco paradójico es que tenemos una sola compañía de agua a nivel nacional, y esta agencia externa es la que regula las tarifas, que quedan disociadas de los costos de funcionamiento de la empresa. Es algo que es como raro. ¿Y cuál era la otra pregunta?
Federal es nacional, la agencia.
La agencia es nacional. La agencia es nacional.
Sí.
Mildred preguntaba sobre los grises. Dentro de los grises que quedan de lado es que sectores importantes de funcionamiento de la compañía fueron privatizados. Fueron no privatizados estrictamente, sino tercerizados, concesionados. Entonces, todo el sector que toma el consumo, que mide la cantidad de consumo de agua en cada una de las casas de las personas, el sector que hace las reparaciones en la vía pública, incluso el sector que atiende a los usuarios en el propio edificio de la empresa, son empresas privadas, tercerizadas. Y esto sucedió durante los gobiernos progresistas aún. Entonces lo que sucede es que ahora los gobiernos conservadores dicen, si estas formas no eran consideradas privatización durante los gobiernos progresistas, nosotros las vamos a continuar usando, pero ahora para la gestión de las nuevas plantas de tratamiento de aguas y para las nuevas plantas de potabilización de agua. Entonces esos grises ahora amenazan con convertirse en grises más oscuros en el escenario de estos nuevos gobiernos.
Muy interesante. I don't know if does everyone understand what's being said, or do we need any discussion? Tom is shaking his head. Is that a yes or a no?
I can't speak Spanish, but.
Okay, so I think what's really interesting here, Tom, is he's talking about the gray areas where they've privatized meter reading, they've privatized repair, they've privatized customer service. And then that quietly, in an obscure way, then leads to the government saying the next time, well, let's privatize the next plant that we build. And so it's kind of a creeping privatization that's occurring here, which I think you would also find interesting as you think about your broader project. So we have a state-owned enterprise nationwide with a national level regulator that should be paying attention to these things. And yet inside that, there's this creeping privatization that's happening. That's what's so fascinating about the Uruguayan story, because it's a country that's well known for having a lot of support for state-owned enterprises with social equity at the core. And here's a case where that's being eroded away.
Yeah,
was that more or less right, Carlos?
That is right. There's also a question from Kathleen in the chat, Carlos. Did you see that?
Oh, I didn't. Carlos, can you see the chat?
Yes, yes, I can. Bueno, las organizaciones sociales, los movimientos sociales que llevaron adelante la reforma constitucional del año 2004, se han mantenido activos, denunciando todo este proceso de privatización a través de asociaciones público-privadas, ¿no? Y reclamando que se cumpliera la reforma constitucional, ¿no? Y ese es uno de los problemas que existen, ¿no? Han sido, como señalas, una suerte de escapatoria o de violación de la Constitución directamente, ¿no? Incluso, digamos, estos colectivos han presentado recursos ante el sistema jurídico, ante la Suprema Corte de Justicia en Uruguay, tratando de anular los contratos o de llevar adelante medidas contra algunas leyes que avanzan en esto de la asociación público-privada o la privatización de los sistemas de acuífero. Sobre lo que estás preguntando, Gabriela, en el chat, lo que sucede es que gran parte de las áreas rurales no tienen conexión con el sistema de agua potable, sino que ahí son las propias comunidades que se abastecen a través de pozos. Sobre todo las regiones de menos de 3.000 habitantes tienen una cobertura muy baja y prácticamente no tienen acceso al tratamiento de aguas. Entonces esa es la principal diferencia. Por eso el gobierno conservador actual está haciendo un gran plan de construcción de fábrica de plantas de tratamiento de agua en todo el país.
I'd like to bring Gabriela into this discussion because we're talking about these gray areas and the escapatoria. What would be the word in English for that, Caitlin?
Loophole, I think.
Okay, loopholes. Well, I'm thinking of the Italian case where the multiple utility firms were used as a loophole, weren't they, by local governments to avoid EU regulations encouraging privatization, and instead they created corporate entities and they contracted essentially to themselves. Is that right? From an earlier period?
Yes, I suppose it is similar, but we have Mildred. We have also. I was listening all this intervention that, and I found this Carlos' speech very interesting about the rule that this Hindi authority. It is a sort of authority like us, like our national independent authority, but I cannot understand how how it really works, because in Italy, as I said before, it just prevent an increase of tariffs if it is not justified by investment in water quality and in water. But that didn't happen in Uruguay, isn't it? Isn't the same?
Es similar. En el caso de Uruguay, esta unidad reguladora, la URSEA, simplemente determina la tarifa y controla la eficiencia de la gestión de la empresa. Grado de cobertura, expansión de las inversiones, funcionamiento, algunos indicadores de gestión empresarial. Pero todo lo que es el plan de inversión, el plan de obras, el plan de gestión, lo lleva adelante la empresa de manera autónoma. La entidad esta no tiene autoridad sobre la empresa.
Okay. In Italy, instead, we have this sort of independent authority, but at the same time, as Mildred suggests me, it is there are these listed multi-utility company that find always the way to increase the tariffs, also as in the case of ACEA, that also if they don't justify they promise the investment, but and new and other things that is that they can now in the last year justify also the managerial cost, not only the investment in infrastructure, and this allow them to increase more the tariffs, also if they don't invest just in infrastructure. So they with the higher cost that they justify the increase with the higher cost in the management. Okay, but this has been allowed just in the last years.
Is this the case in Uruguay as well, Carlos? The management costs are allowed to be included in the tariff?
Sí, pero de todas maneras el principal costo de la empresa de agua en los últimos 15 años ha sido el aumento del gasto en el proceso de potabilización de agua. El costo administrativo se mantiene porque incluso el número de funcionarios se ha reducido porque se han tercerizado muchas de las áreas. Entonces el principal costo es la compra de materiales químicos y el mejoramiento del sistema tecnológico de tratamiento del agua por el gran deterioro del agua en las cuencas.
So it's a technological issue, less than managerial. Go ahead, Gabriela.
Electricity, probably.
No,
Go ahead, Renan.
there was Renan that was speaking.
No, just saying that probably also electricity is a key cost. Eletricidad en el tratamiento de las aguas.
I would like to ask also a question for the other speakers, because what I didn't see in the other paper that I didn't understand, if there are also cases like in Italy of this kind of multi-utility that provide other services like waste and energy apart from services, waste collection apart from water services, that allow this company to achieve also economies of scope and not only economies of scale. But probably, I don't know if
in Uruguay, esto es el caso, ¿no? Que hay empresas que proveen servicios de internet y luz eléctrica a la vez y tienen economías de scope.
Sí, sí, pero que no están vinculadas con la empresa de agua. Pero sí, también hay empresas nacionales, estatales, de electricidad, de telefonía y de internet, que son las principales del país.
Okay, but there are not companies that mixed. Okay, that provide more than one service, right?
No, solamente un servicio cada una y no tienen.
Okay, separados.
La conexión que tienen es que todas dependen de esta unidad reguladora común.
Okay.
In the US, there are several joint utilities that do electricity, water, waste. Memphis, I think, has one. There's also a lot of the instances where there's broadband internet network that I mentioned. In many cases, it's run by the electric utility.
Okay.
I think that varies a lot by state, right? Because like in Pennsylvania, that's not what where I live, that's not what it looks like at all. You have an electric company, you have a gas company, you have water, and sometimes the drinking water separate from the sanitation. And then in terms of waste collection, like garbage pickup, that's also separate. Usually there's two options for internet providers that are, Comcast and Verizon, where I live.
Yeah, it's very state by state in the US. And as far as electricity goes, you also have the added complication that some states are deregulated and some states are not. So you sometimes have these states where you have private providers and public providers. You have some states where you still have monopoly providers and no competition. So the state by state is very different.
Okay.
Just the one quick thing I'd like to add is in some states, like in the West, there are, hydropower is big. So electric then it's not connected to drinking water, but it's connected to water because it's hydropower. And of course, like in a place like Brazil, a lot of electricity is hydropower. So I'm just thinking it'd be interesting to talk about that connection too. But
yeah, sure. So the first part of the questions related with Gabriela told us the chat that in the case in Brazil, the basic scenario, the most common case is that you have water and sanitation together in the same company, independently of municipal or state level company, but it's together, sanitation and water. Electricity, it's almost always, if not always, state level. So we have some 27 companies, and the internet, telecom are separate companies, in general multinationals. Kathleen rose a very interesting point related with hydropower generation and water treatment. It's a strong debate which happens in the national agency for water management, not in the utilities company. So we have a national system almost fully connected between electricity, hydropower, electricity, but there's a fight between electricity and water treatment. What you have seen for many years by now is that the electricity companies are stronger. So they kind of get their water first, generate hydropower electricity, and then they give the water downstreams for water treatment plants. There are a lot of exceptions, but the broader case is this.
So there's a lot of interesting issues here as we get beyond a dichotomy of public-private. We think about management, we think about regulation, we think about the different actors. That's why I thought that Gabriela gave us an interesting approach when she thought about the stakeholder approach and these different dimensions that you might measure performance on rather than just a simple one of price or cost. And I'm hoping that this discussion we've had today will stimulate ideas for future work, for future collaborations, for future special issues, whether it's utilities policy, which is a multi-utility journal, or the more specific journals like that are in water or electricity, or urban journals, or public administration journals, or geography journals, where we might be able to carry this debate forward. And that's why we wanted to have a discussion today. And Renan, would you like to say anything more?
Well, indeed, I had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I can't share all of that. But sure, I think an interesting thing that you just said is that we are multidisciplinary also. So maybe we could try a special issue in a different kind of journal, maybe more related with urban planning or urban studies or something like that. Personally, it would be interesting for me. And maybe think a little bit more about comparative studies with this multi perspectives on international landscape. So I think that I would like to talk a little bit more, we don't have time, on how exactly remunicipalization is happening. For example, Carlos just told us that the national government in Uruguay bought the shares of a previous private company. Is that the case in other part of the world? And if so, how does happen the valuation process of these shares? Are the state paying higher than they should, or they are paying a fair market value for these shares? That's one kind of question. And another one is close related with David McDonald and Thomas research, and also Mildred research, which is with this broader international trends of remunicipalization. If trend or not, or it's a hype or not, I think there's a good avenue of comparative research on it.
Absolutely. And I'd also just put in the chat that one way that's nice to come together is to come together around conferences. And I just looked it up, the Urban Affairs Association conference. The deadline for abstracts is December 1, that's 2 weeks away. I think the conference is going to be in person in DC. I don't know if it's got any hybrid elements to it or not. So the beauty of the Zoom world is it's costless to come together. But the beauty of being face-to-face is that you get to meet each other and have more time for casual conversation. If there's any interest on the part of anyone in this group to put together a session for urban affairs on some of the issues we've talked about here, we could stay on the call a few more minutes if people have time and talk about that and see if anyone is planning to be in DC in next April. I think it's April. I'll have to look up the dates. I think it's April 12th, but that's the AAG. I think that conference is already closed, and I think it's going to be both virtual and in person, but I think the abstracts for this year are closed. The next one that would be coming up is the Planning Association, where we presented some of these papers back in October. That would be another possibility, and that would be next fall. And I don't know about LASA, when LASA is meeting next.
Those proposals closed it was early, like September, I think. So it would have to be the, 2023.
So the Planning Professors Conference deadline will be sometime in February. So we have time to think of that. And I know some of you come to that. I think next year, I don't know whether it's going to be a hybrid model or not. A lot of people have enjoyed the hybrid model, and there's a little bit of pressure, I think, to keep it. But is anyone interested in putting together something for urban affairs? Caitlin might be. I see a shaking of the head. But I don't know if others are. Urban Affairs is nice, Carlos and Renan, because it has a strong Latin America track. For an English language conference based in the US, it has a Latin America track. Let me say that.
Yeah, last year I sent a paper. We had a session together, but then I need to quit because of by Gabriela. I need to quit because a lot of reasons, included the pandemics. But yeah, next year I couldn't go there, so there's a lot of things. So maybe the planning association next to call, it's better for my time set.
Okay. And then the other thing that I really want to point out, and Carlos, thank you so much for participating, is the challenges of language barriers and the English bias in the international journals. And we can work together the editor was very pleased that you submitted, and Renan as well, but it's still very, very difficult when you're not working in English as your first language. Gabriela also feels this. And so also thinking of regional journals that are based in Portuguese or Spanish or Italian, where you might invite some of the rest of us to participate, and we'll have the same challenges you face getting our material into the appropriate language. I think we need to create, this is the dream of the Young Scholars International, is to truly create an international academia, where we like today, we talked across 3 languages or 4 and tried to do it better. So any ideas you have on that, I'm also very open to helping to support in any way that I can. And I think all of us getting to know each other here gives us that opportunity.
Muchas gracias, Mildred, por la posibilidad de participar. Aquí en Mercosur tenemos muchas publicaciones que son bilingües, portugués y español. Quizás hay que pensar en alguna que sea multilingüe y que podamos escribir cada quien en su lengua y compartir las discusiones de cualquier manera. Es más difícil, pero es posible.
Sí, sí.
Es muy buena idea.
There's at least 2 here in Brazil, which is the National Urban Planning Association, which accepts the 3 languages. And also, I need to check, but I think there's a national important journal, somewhat important, which is called Cadernos de las Metrópolis, Metropolitan Journal, something like that, which I think also accept the 3 languages, Spanish, Portuguese, and English, of course. Well, it's not that difficult to reach out to the editors and ask them if you're interested. I could take a look at least at these 2 journals.
And the Journal of Urban Affairs, we had talked about going to an urban journal. That would be a journal that's interested. Urban Studies might be interested. Utilities Policy continues to be interested in these issues. So let's keep in touch. Maybe we'll try to pull together a list of everybody's emails just to follow up after this. And as you get ideas of conferences or journals, it's nice to know who else might participate, because you have to put together the session in advance. And but this has been great. Thank you everyone for coming and for hanging on. And does anyone have any last minute comments they'd like to make?
All I'd like to say is that if you do come to DC, anyone comes to DC for a conference or anything, let me know. I'm based outside of DC, so happy to entertain or provide some office space. If you need internet or something, just let me know if you're coming to DC.
Well, thank you, Renan, for organizing this with the Young Scholars Initiative. This is really great. I like the dream. And, how does everyone join? You might also follow up with that, because you have a lot of young scholars here today. Not me, but
thank you to everyone.
So thank you, everyone. Especially thank to you, Mildred. Bye-bye, guys. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.